She didn't flinch when the blade touched her uniform. She didn't scream when three armed men backed her into a corner with nowhere to run. She didn't beg when the most powerful officer on the base stepped into the hallway and smiled. They had done this before, to women who trusted the system, to soldiers who believed rank meant protection. They had walked away clean every single time. But this time, they had chosen the wrong woman. They thought they were hunting prey. They had no idea they were standing inside a trap that had been 4 years in the making. If this story pulls you in from the very first second, follow my channel, hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The Nevada desert had a way of swallowing things whole. Heat rose off the cracked flats in visible waves, bending the horizon into something liquid and unreliable. Dust settled on every surface within hours, on rifle stocks, on boot leather, on the faces of soldiers who stood at attention long enough to stop feeling their own sweat. Iron Ridge Joint Combat Center sat in the dead center of that emptiness, 60 miles from the nearest civilian road, surrounded by dry mountains that trapped sound and kept secrets with equal efficiency. From the outside, it looked like exactly what it claimed to be: a premier combat readiness installation, one of the most respected joint training centers in the American military system, the kind of place officers competed for assignments to, the kind of place that produced careers. From the inside, it was something else entirely. Maya Riker knew the difference before she ever set foot through the front gate. She had read the files on the drive out, not the official installation report. That was clean, formatted, decorated with commendations and performance metrics. She meant the other file, the one that didn't have a cover sheet, the one that listed 12 names in 8 years, women who had come to Iron Ridge as capable, decorated soldiers and left as something quieter, something broken at an angle that never quite healed right. Reassignment requests filed with vague medical justifications, complaints submitted and quietly closed. One formal investigation opened, then shuttered after the key witness requested emergency family leave and never returned to service. 12 names, 8 years, 0 accountability. Maya had read each page twice on the highway, then folded the file and put it in the locked box beneath the passenger seat of the rental truck. She memorized what she needed. The rest was weight she didn't intend to carry where anyone could see it. She pulled through the main gate at 0610, 90 minutes before the integration briefing, early enough to get a read on the place before it performed for her. The gate guard checked her credentials: integration officer badge, numbered armband, a name she hadn't used in 18 months. He ran it through the system, got his confirmation, handed back her ID with the flat indifference of someone who had processed 1,000 faces that all looked equally temporary. She thanked him in a voice pitched deliberately flat and unremarkable, the kind of voice that slid off memory like water off sealed glass. She drove to the integration barracks, parked, and sat for a moment with the engine off. The base looked immaculate. She had expected that. Every surface was deliberate: the whitewashed stone borders along the pathways, the precisely angled vehicle parking, the way each soldier she could see moved with the mechanical certainty of people who knew they were being watched and had learned to perform accordingly. Discipline was visible everywhere. That was the thing about well-run corruption. It kept everything on the surface spotless. She climbed out of the truck, pulled a single duffel from the back, standard issue green canvas, nothing that would attract a second glance, and walked toward the barracks check-in like she had done it 100 times. She had. Just never here, and never as herself. The integration briefing took place in a long room with institutional lighting and plastic chairs arranged in 6 uneven rows. Maya took a seat in the 3rd row, center, and spent the first 4 minutes of the brief studying the room rather than the presenter. 41 personnel cycling through for the 3-week integration period. Mixed branches like Army, Marine Corps, a handful of Navy technical specialists on exchange rotations. Ages ranging from early 20s to a few mid-career officers clearly here for professional development checkmarks. Most of them already showing the micro-posturing of people figuring out the social hierarchy before the official structure had a chance to impose one. She clocked the 3 of them before the briefing officer finished the first slide. They were sitting in the back row, which was exactly where she expected them. The one in the center was built like a man who had never once questioned whether rooms were big enough for him. broad through the shoulders, jaw set at that particular angle that comes from years of being told your instincts are leadership qualities. He sat with his arm draped over the chair beside him, occupying space that wasn't his because the idea of restraint had never been made personally costly. Logan Pierce, 28 years old, third-generation Marine. His fitness reports read like letters of recommendation written by people afraid of him. His complaint history was invisible, which meant it had been managed very carefully by someone with enough rank to make things disappear. The one on his right was quieter about it. Cole Mercer. Solid, dense, the kind of physical presence that communicated threat without movement. His expression was mostly blank, but his eyes tracked the room with a specificity that Maya recognized. He was looking at women the way hunters look at terrain, assessing angles and distances and likely responses. He had been doing it for so long it looked like neutral observation. It wasn't. The one on the left sat slightly apart from the other two, and that small distance was its own communication. Ethan Knox. Younger than the other two by 4 years, which meant he had come into their orbit already formed, already shaped by whatever they had decided he should be. He was the one who laughed at the right moments, who escalated situations just past the point where someone else started it, who created the conditions and then stepped back slightly so someone else took the visible step. He was, in Maya's professional assessment, the most dangerous of the three. Not because he was the strongest, but because he understood how to use ambiguity as a weapon. She looked at each of them for exactly the duration of ordinary glancing around, and then turned her attention forward to the briefing officer's slide deck. She already had what she needed. The first 3 days were performance. Maya had designed her cover with the specific goal of being legible as vulnerable without being obvious about it. There was a version of this kind of undercover work that involved creating elaborate backstories and layered identities, and it had its place. But institutional predators rarely demanded biographical complexity. What they looked for was simpler and more primal. They looked for someone who was not going to fight back. So she gave them that. On day 1, during the early morning fitness assessment, she ran her 3-mile at a pace that put her comfortably in the bottom third of the group. Fast enough not to draw attention as a liability, slow enough to signal that she was nowhere near the top. She knew her actual time would put her in the 98th percentile for her age and service category. She ran deliberately slower, controlling her breathing in a way that required more discipline than running flat out would have. On the morning of day 2, during the close quarters combat familiarization exercise, she let a training partner control the grapple for 90 seconds before slipping out of it with a technique that looked more like luck than skill. The partner, a young Army specialist who was genuinely good and didn't need to be artificially challenged, got a clean submission and looked pleased about it. Maya tapped out at the right moment and said, "Good control," in the mildly impressed voice of someone encountering a technique they hadn't quite figured out yet. She missed her first marksmanship qualification run by 4 points. Not by much. The kind of near miss that looked like nerves rather than unfamiliarity with the weapon. By the end of day 2, she was invisible in the way she intended. Not the weakest presence on the base, but categorized. Filed under a specific assessment. She had watched Logan Pierce's gaze pass over her twice during the fitness run, then again during chow. She knew what that kind of look meant. He was making a calculation. Day 3 was when they started. It began small, the way it always began small. A chair slid away from her in the briefing room just slightly too early, so she had to step around it. An issued piece of equipment, chest rig, adjustable, arrived with the buckle set to the smallest possible sizing, requiring her to stand in the gear bay resizing it while other personnel moved around her. Both of these could be accidents. Both were designed to communicate that they weren't. At chow that evening, Logan sat down across from her without asking. Not beside her, across where she'd have to look at him to see anything past the tray in front of her. "Integration treating you all right?" he asked. His voice was the kind of warm that made every word feel like a question about how much you'd let him get away with. "Fine," she said. She didn't look up from her food. "You were in my group for the CQB familiarization this morning." He said it like she should already be grateful for that proximity. "Looked like you had some trouble with the shoot move sequence." She had executed the shoot move sequence correctly and allowed herself to stumble on the reset between the 3rd and 4th position. The stumble had been precisely calibrated. "Still getting used to the bay layout," she said. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're deciding whether an explanation is adequate or whether it's an opening. You need to build faster. Hesitation gets you killed in a dynamic environment. He said it with the tone of someone bestowing a gift. I appreciate the feedback, she said. He held for a moment, waiting for something more, some indication of the specific kind of deference he was used to getting. And when she didn't provide it, a flicker of recalibration moved across his face. Not enough to concern him, just enough to make her interesting in the way that prey becomes interesting when it doesn't immediately respond correctly to the first probe. He stood up, tapped the table once with 2 fingers, a small territorial gesture, and walked away. Maya finished her food and kept her expression completely neutral. Inside her right cargo pocket, the digital audio recorder had captured 5 minutes and 42 seconds of clean audio. She found Abby Lawson on the afternoon of day 2, though it took her until day 3 to understand what she was looking at. Abby was 23. Marines. She moved through the base with the specific quality of hyper-alertness that Maya recognized not as combat readiness, but as survival behavior. The way a person moves when they have learned that any space can become unsafe without warning. She sat with her back to walls. She tracked doors. She watched Logan Pierce's position on the training field with the peripheral awareness of someone who had been burned by not watching early enough. Maya didn't approach her directly. She waited until Abby was alone in the gear bay after afternoon maintenance checks, working through a secondary piece of kit that didn't need attention, and sat down nearby to do the same with her own rig. They worked in silence for several minutes. The buckle on the secondary is stripped on half the rigs in Bay 3, Maya said, not looking up. Worth checking yours before you trust it in a dynamic scenario. Abby glanced sideways. How do you know which bay? I was in there yesterday. Noticed it. A pause. Abby went back to her kit. Thanks. They worked in silence for another few minutes, and then Abby said quietly, without looking up, How long have you been in? Long enough, Maya said. You? Coming up on 3 years. She said it the way people say a number they're not sure how to feel about yet. You like it? Abby's hand stilled for a fraction of a second on the hardware she was checking. Then she kept moving. Most of the time. It was the most precise answer Maya had heard in days. She didn't push further. She had what she needed from that sentence, the shape of what was being left out of it, the specific weight of a 3-year career that was being held carefully and tentatively rather than gripped with certainty. She would come back to Abby, gently, slowly, at a pace that wouldn't frighten her, and wouldn't signal intent too early. She needed Abby to trust her before she needed Abby to talk. The thing about Colonel Victor Hale was that he didn't look like what he was. Maya had expected that. The file told her enough about how he operated to know that the presentation would be immaculate. And it was. Hale was 54, tall without being imposing, precise without being rigid. He moved through the base with the easy authority of someone who had held rank long enough that it had become physical, had settled into the way he held his shoulders and occupied a hallway. His service record was distinguished in the way that meant very little and impressed very many. A full spread of theater rotations, commendations, a Bronze Star citation that was specific enough to be credible and vague enough to be unfalsifiable. He spoke to personnel with a careful democratic warmth. First names, real eye contact, the practiced attentiveness of a man who understood that power over people required making them feel seen. He greeted the integration group during a walkthrough on day 2, paused to speak to several personnel individually, and when he reached Maya said, Integration Officer Calloway, settling in? Yes, sir, she said. Installation is well run. We work hard at that, he said, with a smile that was perfectly genuine and completely unreadable. Then he moved on. That night, reviewing audio captures from the day, Maya replayed his greeting 3 times. Not because there was anything obviously wrong with it, because there was nothing wrong with it at all, and a man who had been enabling systematic predation for the better part of 3 decades had either a conscience that made noise or a silence that was cultivated. Hale's silence was cultivated. She could hear it in the precision of every single word, nothing wasted, nothing exposed, nothing offered that couldn't be retrieved. He knew who she wasn't. She needed to make sure he didn't figure out who she was. The surveillance infrastructure had taken 6 weeks to plan and 4 days to pre-position. 2 months before Maya's arrival at Iron Ridge, a maintenance crew, genuine contractor personnel operating under a federal services blanket contract that provided plausible cover for their presence, had cycled through the base as part of an HVAC upgrade to Building 7 and an IT infrastructure review of 3 secondary administrative buildings. In the process, 2 technicians spent approximately 19 hours installing a network of passive audio recorders and micro-lensed cameras in 9 locations across the base. The equipment was military-grade, designed to be indistinguishable from standard conduit fittings and cable management hardware unless you were looking for it with a specific knowledge of what it was. The installation covered the eastern equipment corridor of Building 4, 3 sections of the main training field perimeter, the gear bay access hallways, and, most critically, the narrow secondary passage behind the warrant officer's administrative suite that connected the main corridor to the loading bay. That passage was where 2 of the 12 cases had documented their first encounters with systematic harassment. It was off the main security camera grid. The lighting was inconsistent. It was the kind of space that people with bad intentions used precisely because it seemed unmonitored. The network fed to an encrypted relay that transmitted to a hardened receiver positioned in a nondescript government vehicle parked off base, staffed around the clock by 2 personnel from the Federal Investigative Unit that Maya technically fell under. They logged everything, flagged audio segments by keyword and acoustic signature, kept a running timeline. Maya's role was to be the presence on the ground, the human element that passive surveillance couldn't replicate. She needed to be in the right places, create the right opportunities, and maintain her cover while building enough documented evidence to survive a military legal process that would be adversarial from every direction. That meant patience. It meant sitting through 3 days of escalating behavior, the displaced chairs, the equipment sabotage, the intrusions into personal space during drills, the comments delivered in voices pitched specifically so that only she could hear them, and not reacting in any way that would alter the behavioral pattern she was trying to document. Cole Mercer made his first direct move on the morning of Day 3. It happened during the tactical communication exercise, which was run on a partially simulated CQB range that used radio handhelds for internal comms between fireteam positions. Maya was assigned to secondary element, which put her at the far end of the range in a covered position near the equipment wall while the primary element worked through the breach sequence. Cole appeared at her position without a tactical reason to be there. "You're holding the radio wrong," he said. She was not holding the radio wrong. Her grip was textbook. "Left thumb goes here," he said, and without asking, placed his hand over hers on the radio housing, adjusting nothing meaningful about the grip because there was nothing to adjust. His hand stayed there approximately 3 seconds longer than instruction required. He was close enough that she could feel the heat from his body. Maya's trigger finger stayed completely relaxed. "Got it," she said, and shifted her stance slightly. The kind of micro-adjustment that created a few additional inches between them without requiring a direct confrontation. Just enough to make the point without making it a confrontation. He let go. Looked at her for a moment with the evaluative flatness of someone checking whether a boundary had been successfully established. When she didn't react further, he moved back toward the primary element without another word. In her earpiece, the tiny receiver disguised as a standard communications piece, she heard the brief double click that meant the off-base team had captured the audio clearly. She keyed her radio and called out a position update in the proper format. She kept her voice absolutely steady. "Bob." Ethan Knox came last, and he was subtler than the other 2, which was exactly what she had expected. On the afternoon of Day 3, during a water break between training evolutions, Knox sat down beside her on the concrete barrier outside Building 2 and said nothing for almost a minute and a half. He drank from his canteen, watched the training field, then said, conversationally, "Word in the group is you're a little over your head here." She took a drink from her own canteen, let the sentence settle without helping it. "That right," she said. "Not a question. Logan's been paying attention to you. That can go a couple different ways." He said it casually, like a weather forecast. "Easier if you sort of get yourself sorted out before he decides you need additional instruction." She looked at him. His expression was cooperative, genuinely helpful on the surface, underneath it something that enjoyed the particular texture of this kind of conversation. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. "We're all looking out for each other," he said with a smile. "Integration's a team effort." He stood up and walked away. She watched the dust settle around his boots and thought, 3 days? She was 3 days in, and all three of them had made contact, established pattern, and begun the escalation cycle. The file had said average time to confrontation was 4 to 7 days. They were running ahead of that. She looked out at the training field where a new group was working through land navigation stations under the afternoon sun. Patient, she reminded herself. Wait for them to cross the line they always cross. She had waited 15 years for an assignment like this one. She could wait 4 more days. That night, in her bunk after lights out, Maya lay still in the dark and listened to the sounds of the barracks settle around her, the distant vibration of the HVAC system, the creak of cots, someone's phone buzzing softly 3 rows down, the breathing of 40 people who thought they understood where they were and what this place was. She stared at the ceiling and ran the timeline in her head. The 3 of them had been operating at Iron Ridge for 14 months. Before Iron Ridge, Pierce had 2 previous duty stations where informal complaints had been lodged and closed without action. Mercer had 1 prior incident that had been reclassified as a unit cohesion matter and handled internally, which in practice meant it had been given a different name and buried. Knox was newer to the pattern, but newer didn't mean innocent. It meant he had found people who were already doing what he wanted to do and attached himself to their infrastructure. Hale had been at Iron Ridge for 6 years. The timing of his arrival and the pattern of closed complaints overlapped with mathematical precision that no one had bothered to map until Maya's unit requested the full complaint registry under a federal investigative mandate. It was not subtle once you could see the whole picture. It required you to be able to see the whole picture, which was exactly what Hale had spent 6 years ensuring no one was positioned to do. Maya turned on her side. She thought about the 12 women in the file, not as case numbers, as people, the ones who had requested reassignment, the ones whose careers had quietly deflated into lateral positions and administrative roles far from anything they'd trained for, the one who had submitted a formal complaint in month 3 of her tour, had her housing assignment changed the following week, had her immediate supervisor replaced with someone who signed every unfavorable efficiency report that arrived for the next 4 months, and had submitted a voluntary separation request 90 days later. 3 decades of this. Hale's files suggested he might have been involved in similar patterns at 2 previous commands before Iron Ridge, but the evidence there was thinner, harder to build a case on. This time was different. This time there was a federal mandate, pre-positioned surveillance, and a Tier 1 operator with the specific combination of skills and history needed to get close enough to make the case airtight. She thought about why she had been the one chosen for this assignment, and she thought about the years she had spent after the incident at Fort Calloway, not at this base, but at a different one, 9 years ago, when she had been a much younger and far less controlled version of herself. When the thing that happened to her had happened, and she had not handled it with patience or strategy. She had handled it with fury, which had been entirely human and entirely counterproductive, and had nearly ended her career before a commanding officer, a woman named Colonel Diane Westmore, who had the tactical patience of someone who had lived through 3 separate institutional betrayals herself, had sat across from her in a temporary office and said, "You have 2 choices. You can burn this down right now and walk away with nothing, or you can build something that they can't take apart. Which do you want?" It had taken Maya 4 days to answer. Then she had said, "The second one." It had taken her 11 more years to get here. She closed her eyes, regulated her breathing down to 6 counts in, 6 counts out, a technique from a SEER course that had no name and left no record. Her heart rate settled to 52 beats per minute. Day 4 tomorrow. She had a feeling about day 4. She was right. The morning started without ceremony. PT formation at 0530, 2 miles of group run in the pre-dawn cold that was almost cruel in contrast to the heat that would hit by 0900. Maya ran in the middle of the pack, not at the back, which would have looked like performance, just middle, unremarkable. Breakfast was standard. Chow hall noise, metal trays, the smell of reconstituted eggs and industrial coffee. She ate quickly and moved out, because today she had an early maintenance check on her assigned equipment locker in Building 4, a made-up procedural requirement she had arranged through the integration administrative system, which required only an online form submission and created a documented, legitimate reason for her to be in Building 4's eastern section at 07:15. She walked the main path toward Building 4 with her duffel over one shoulder. Behind her, she heard footsteps. Not immediately. They started maybe 100 yards back, with the specific cadence of people who aren't in a hurry because they don't think they need to be. She tracked them with her peripheral awareness and the reflective surface of a parked vehicle's passenger window as she passed it. Logan, Cole, Ethan, following at a distance that would read as coincidental to any casual observer. They knew about her equipment check. They had access to the integration scheduling system. Logan, specifically, had a secondary administrative access level that his role didn't technically require, but that no one had revoked. She had flagged this in her pre-mission assessment and left it alone deliberately. She needed them to use it. She pushed through the door of Building 4 and turned left toward the Eastern Equipment Corridor. The corridor was long, low-ceilinged, and lit by fluorescent strips that buzzed faintly at one end where a ballast was going. The main security cameras covered the entrance and the primary equipment bay. The eastern section, a narrow passage running between two rows of industrial shelving units stacked with training equipment, fell into the blind spot that the maintenance crew had mapped precisely 6 weeks ago. She moved to her assigned equipment locker, opened it, and began going through the inventory process on the printed sheet she'd brought. Her hands moved steadily through the items: carabiners, load-bearing straps, a training radio, a training sidearm, dummy magazines, while her breathing stayed deliberate and quiet. The door at the corridor entrance pushed open 2 minutes later. All three of them. She heard them before she saw them, and she kept her eyes on the inventory sheet when she finally did look up, because the appropriate response to three colleagues entering a shared space was brief acknowledgement, not wariness. She gave them brief acknowledgement. "Morning," she said, and looked back at her inventory sheet. No one responded for 3 seconds. Then Logan said, "You're always alone." She marked a check mark on the sheet. "Equipment check." "I know what it is." He walked forward slowly, Cole and Ethan spreading out to either side, with the practiced spacing of people who had done this before. Not military spacing, the kind you drill for tactical scenarios, but the other kind, the kind designed to eliminate comfortable exits from a conversation. "Funny you always end up in the quiet spots." "I go where the inventory takes me," she said. "Right." He stopped about 6 feet from her. The shelving ran along both sides of the narrow corridor, limiting lateral movement. Ethan had drifted to the far end, cutting off the longer exit. Cole was to her left, Logan directly ahead. "Thing is, I've been watching you since you got here, and I think there's a problem." She set down her inventory sheet on the shelf beside her, slowly, calmly. "What problem?" "You don't fit," he said. He made it sound factual. "And people who don't fit create problems for unit performance. You follow?" "I hear what you're saying," she said. He nodded, as if that were progress. "So what we're going to do is have a little corrective conversation, help you understand the standard, because we take standards seriously here." He paused. "Don't we?" The last 2 words went to Cole and Ethan separately, and both of them confirmed it with the ease of people running a script they'd rehearsed enough times that they'd stopped noticing the lines. "Seriously," Cole said. Ethan said nothing, but smiled. Maya looked at Logan and said, "I want to be clear that I'm not interested in this conversation." "No, I know you're not," he said. "That's kind of the point." She cataloged the physical situation with the quick, involuntary precision of her training. Confined space, 9 feet wide, shelving at chest height on both sides, one entry point behind her partially blocked by Cole's position, the far exit 10 feet ahead blocked by Ethan, a training radio on the shelf to her left, a dummy sidearm in her open locker to her right. No live weapons on anyone present. Training facility protocols prohibited them in equipment bays during non-exercise periods, a detail she had confirmed before choosing this location. No live weapons, but that didn't mean no weapons. Ethan reached to his belt and unsnapped a training knife, the rubber-bladed kind used in combative exercises, heavy enough to bruise, blunt enough to be technically non-lethal, and issued to every integration personnel as standard kit. He held it loosely, pointing down, not raised yet, just visible. "We're going to walk through some standards," Logan said. His voice had shifted. Still warm on the surface, something else underneath it now. Starting with what happens when someone gets assessed as not mission capable. There's a protocol. We take it seriously. I understand you're telling me that, Maya said. Good. He took a step forward. First standard, you respond appropriately to senior guidance. Second standard, you don't make problems for the unit. Third standard, he stopped, looked her over in the way that was designed to feel like assessment, but was designed to feel like exposure. You keep your situation clear, understand what you are and what you aren't. The buzzing of the fluorescent at the far end of the corridor seemed louder suddenly. I'll give you one more chance to walk out of this corridor, Maya said. Logan's expression changed for just a moment, a genuine flicker of surprise, the kind that happens when the script encounters something it wasn't written to handle. Then he smiled, and the smile was something she had seen in the file, in the description of the last confrontation that a woman named Sergeant Clara Vasquez had documented before her complaint was closed. The smile of someone who had been surprised before and found that surprise never ultimately changed anything. See, that's the problem, he said. You think you have options. Ethan moved forward, the rubber knife coming up from his side. And at that precise moment, footsteps entered the corridor from the main entrance. Everyone froze. Colonel Victor Hale walked into the eastern section with the measured pace of a man taking a morning walkthrough. He took in the scene, the spacing, the positions, the knife visible in Ethan's hand, and his expression went through several calculations in under 2 seconds before settling on something that Maya would later describe in her written report as deliberate blankness overriding initial alarm. He looked at Maya, then at Logan, then at the knife. Problem here? He said. Logan relaxed fractionally. Just a standards conversation, sir. Corrective guidance. Hale looked at Maya for a moment longer, and she looked back at him with the controlled expression of someone who was genuinely frightened and working hard not to show it, which was the expression that told Hale exactly what he needed to know about what he thought this situation was. Carry on, he said, and walked back out of the corridor. The footsteps receded, the door closed. Logan looked back at Maya with the expanded confidence of a man who had just received a green light. Like I was saying, he said, options. Ethan stepped forward. The knife came up. It pressed against the front of her uniform, just below the shoulder, blade edge dragging downward through the fabric in a slow, deliberate motion that opened a 6-inch cut through the outer shell of her shirt without breaking skin. A demonstration. A line crossed not just physically but legally, documented now in 4 separate audio feeds and 2 camera angles in a corridor that everyone on the operation had spent 6 weeks making sure would capture exactly this moment with irrefutable clarity. Maya stood completely still. Her breathing didn't change. Her heart rate, which she had trained for 11 years to control under conditions that would flatten most people, sat at 58 beats per minute. She looked at the cut in her uniform. Then she looked up at Ethan Knox, and something in her eyes shifted. Not anger, not fear, but a specific kind of stillness that the people who had served alongside her longest had learned to recognize as the single warning she gave before she stopped warning. Knox didn't see it coming. That was the thing he would probably never fully process, in whatever time he had left to process anything at his current duty station before the walls closed in. He had been standing close enough to see her eyes change, had watched that shift happen in real time, and had still not understood what it meant until his wrist was bent at an angle that sent white fire straight up his forearm and his fingers went involuntarily slack around the knife handle. The blade hit the concrete floor. The sound was small, a flat, almost anticlimactic clatter, rubber on hard ground, bouncing once before going still. Knox made a noise that wasn't quite a word. His knees wanted to fold. Maya kept the wrist lock applied for exactly 3 additional seconds. Long enough to be unambiguous, short enough to be technically defensible as a response to the physical contact, and then she released it. She stepped back. Her breathing was unchanged. Heart rate, she noted internally, had climbed to 66 beats per minute. That was the adrenaline, not fear. The two felt different, had always felt different, and she had spent enough time in enough places where the stakes were real to know the distinction with precision. This was the body preparing. She was not afraid of Logan Pierce or Cole Mercer or Ethan Knox. She was managing her physiology the same way she managed everything else, with the specific, unhurried economy of someone who had been in situations that made this one look like a classroom drill. She looked at Knox on the floor, then at Logan. Logan's expression had moved through surprise and into something harder. Not retreat, not recalibration, but the specific anger of a man whose control of a situation has been disrupted and who is deciding whether to escalate or pretend it hadn't happened. He decided. "You just put your hands on a Marine, what?" he said. His voice was quiet now, stripped of the warm performance it had carried earlier. "He put a blade against my uniform," she said. "I removed the threat." "That's not—" "I said what I said." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Cole had moved slightly, repositioning from his left side flanking spot toward the center, which put him 6 feet from Maya and changed the geometry of the situation in a way that was meant to feel like closing. She tracked it without turning her head. Knox got to one knee, cradling his right wrist with his left hand. He was breathing through his nose in the measured way of someone working through pain they hadn't expected and weren't sure how to categorize. "You're going to want to think very carefully about your next move," Logan said. "I've already thought about it," Maya said. "Have you thought about yours?" He stared at her. The fluorescent at the end of the corridor buzzed. What happened next surprised her, which wasn't something she would easily admit in the debrief. She had expected him to push further, to escalate again, to lean into the disruption the same way the prior pattern in the file suggested he always had. Escalation was his default. It was what worked for him. It was what had been working for him without consequence for over a decade, and she had built her planning around the expectation that he would continue doing what always worked. Instead, he looked at her for a long 5 seconds, then bent and picked up the training knife from the floor. He straightened, looked at Knox, looked at Cole. "We're done here," he said, and he walked out. Cole followed without a word. Knox got to his feet, avoided her eyes completely, and followed them both. The corridor door swung closed with a pneumatic hiss. Maya stood in the silence for a moment. She picked up her inventory sheet from the shelf where she'd set it, looked at the cut in her uniform, clean, about 6 inches, through the outer shell but not through the layer beneath, and then she finished the inventory. Methodically, item by item, marking the checkboxes with the same careful hand she'd used before any of it happened. She needed 3 more minutes to complete it. She took the 3 minutes. Then she walked out of the building into the hard morning sun, and she sent a single pre-coded text from the encrypted burner in her left cargo pocket. Contact made. Physical threshold reached. Timeline moving. In the nondescript government vehicle parked off base, someone read that message and started a new audio log file. TID. The mess hall that evening was louder than usual. Some kind of inter-unit competition had gone sideways during the afternoon's land navigation exercise. 2 teams had arrived at the same rally point simultaneously from opposite directions. There had been words, and now the mess hall was divided along the clean, invisible lines that form instantly in groups of armed people who have decided to dislike each other. Maya ate on the periphery of it, beside a window, watching. Abby Lawson sat 3 tables away, alone. That was unusual. During the first 3 days, Abby had eaten with a small cluster of other integration personnel. A couple of Army specialists and a female Marine sergeant who seemed to function as a kind of social anchor for the group. Tonight she was alone, and she was not eating so much as moving food around the tray in the specific way of someone whose appetite had been disrupted by something that happened earlier in the day. Maya waited until the tray return line thinned out, then carried her own tray over and sat across from Abby without asking. Abby looked up, didn't tell her to leave. "Tough afternoon?" Maya said. "Land nav went long." Abby poked at something on her tray. "Got paired with Pierce's group for the final leg." Maya kept her expression neutral. "How was that?" "Educational," Abby said, with the tone of someone using a clean word to describe something that wasn't. A beat. "He say something to you?" Maya asked. Abby looked at her directly for the first time. She had steady eyes, dark brown, the kind that had gotten good at calculating how much to trust someone before they let anything through. "Why are you asking?" "Because you're sitting alone and your food's going cold, and you have the look of someone who's trying to decide whether something was bad enough to matter." Abby was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It was nothing specific, nothing I could report." She said the last word with a flat bitterness that had been learned, not invented. "Nothing specific," Maya said. A comment about my scores, about how some people need extra attention. She stopped, picked up her fork, put it down again. The way he looks at you when he says it, like the words are the least of it. Maya nodded slowly. She didn't fill the space with reassurance, because reassurance would be wrong here. It would minimize the thing Abby was trying to articulate, and minimizing was what the system had already done to these women 12 times over. Instead, she just let the sentence sit, let Abby hear it in the air between them, which was sometimes the only useful thing you could do. How long has it been going on? Maya asked. Since week 2 of my first rotation, Abby said it quietly. I'm in my second now. Did you report it? I wrote a statement. She picked up her water glass, set it down. My sergeant, the one who was supposed to receive it, told me it was better handled internally and that a formal report would create problems for my assessment metrics. A pause. He was Pierce's poker buddy. I didn't know that until after. Maya looked at her across the table, at the careful way Abby held herself. Not broken, not defeated, but braced. A young woman who had learned to move through her own workspace like it was a minefield. You did nothing wrong, Maya said. I know that. Abby said it quickly, almost sharply. That's not the part that's hard. Maya let that be true without arguing with it. What's the hard part? Abby looked at her food for a long moment, then, the hard part is that nothing I do changes anything. I can be perfect. Scores, PT, professionalism, all of it. And it doesn't matter. The moment he decides I'm a target, and the entire structure of this place reorganizes around protecting that decision. She paused. I've watched it happen to 3 other women on this installation. Different faces, same ending. The ending isn't written yet, Maya said. Abby looked up at her. That's easy to say. I know, Maya said. I'm saying it anyway. She didn't say more than that. She left Abby with the sentence and her cooling food, gathered her tray, and walked out of the mess hall into the early evening heat. She called in to the operations cell at 2100 from the secure line in the vehicle she'd been assigned a specific rotation to use for this purpose. The call lasted 9 minutes. Knox's wrist? Said the voice on the other end. Agent Delaron, the lead investigator on the off-base team. Sprain at worst. He put a blade against my clothing. I removed it. Logan's response? Withdrew. Which is interesting. She paused. He should have escalated. The pattern in the file suggests escalation is his default response to resistance. You think he's reconsidering? I think he's recalibrating. There's a difference. She looked at the dark desert through the vehicle window. He walked away because something about the exchange didn't give him the result he expected. That doesn't mean he's done. It means he's reevaluating the approach. Timeline still workable? Yes. But Hale's involvement today changes the priority order. He saw the knife, he saw the spacing, he knew exactly what was happening, and he said, carry on. She let that land for a moment on the other end. If he was complicit before, we now have behavioral confirmation he's actively enabling in real time. That changes what we need from the next encounter. Delaron was quiet for a moment. You need him in the room. I need him in the room while something happens that he cannot reasonably claim he didn't understand. Carry on is useful, but a competent defense attorney can work around it. I need him on record making a specific choice while the specifics are undeniable. That means a second encounter? Yes. With you in the middle of it. That's the job, Maya said. Silence on the line. Not hesitation. Delaron had been in the work long enough to know that some operations had unavoidable exposure points, and that arguing against them from outside was a way of pretending the mission didn't have costs. The silence was just the sound of someone registering what the plan required and accepting it. Your call, Delaron said finally, but we move the response unit to 30-second standby starting tomorrow morning. Make it 60 seconds. 30 will make them antsy, and antsy people make noise. 60, he agreed. Anything else? She thought about Abby Lawson sitting alone at that mess hall table with her food going cold. The junior Marine, Lawson. When this goes to deposition, she's going to be a primary witness. Make sure her chain of command contact gets flagged. I think the sergeant she went to initially is connected to Pierce. That needs to be isolated before we move to the formal phase. I'll have it cross-referenced tonight. Good. She paused. That's all. She ended the call and sat in the vehicle for another few minutes before going back to the barracks. The desert was dark and absolutely silent, except for a low wind moving through the creosote somewhere off to the west. The kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful so much as suspended, like the stillness before a weather system arrives. She had been in operations before where she'd sat in similar silences and run the same kind of mental inventory. Assets confirmed, timeline sequenced, contingencies mapped. And she had learned years ago that the thing that always remained after the inventory was completed was not tactical. It was personal, and it arrived whether she invited it or not. Tonight it came in the form of a very specific memory. Fort Calloway. 9 years ago. A stairwell, not a corridor. A different installation, different desert, same darkness underneath it. She had been 26, 18 months out of the training pipeline that had made her whatever she was becoming, and she had not yet learned the difference between the anger that sharpens you and the anger that makes you sloppy. The man in that stairwell had made his move, and she had responded the way she'd wanted to respond rather than the way strategy required, and she had nearly broken his jaw, and the investigation that followed had nearly ended everything. Her career, her security clearance, the 15 years of work that hadn't happened yet but that she was in the process of building. She had testified in front of a review board. She had told the truth, including the part where she had not waited. The board had found in her favor, ultimately, on the grounds that her account was corroborated by 2 witnesses who had been afraid to come forward initially. But it was close. Closer than it should have been. And the lesson she had taken from the closeness was not that she had been wrong to defend herself. She had been right to defend herself, and she would make the same physical choice again. But that righteousness without documentation is a voice against a system, and systems win that argument every single time, which was why she was here now. With hidden recorders and pre-positioned cameras and 60-second standby protocols, and a federal investigative mandate that gave her authority the system couldn't selectively ignore. She was not the same person she'd been at Fort Calloway. She was not even sure that person was entirely gone. But she had built something around the outside of her that was more useful than raw fury, and she intended to use every piece of it. Day 5 hit with the particular joylessness of a schedule that had been designed by someone who believed discomfort built character. The integration group was up at 0430 for a cold water immersion circuit, which was exactly as miserable as it sounded. A series of obstacle and movement tasks interspersed with repeated submersions in water tanks cooled to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, administered in the gray pre-dawn darkness with the desert temperature at 51. Maya went through it alongside everyone else, keeping herself in the middle third, letting her face show the appropriate degree of controlled discomfort. She had trained in colder water, longer, without the recovery intervals that the integration circuit provided. She said none of this. Afterward, during the recovery warm-up and gear check, she found herself standing next to a soldier she hadn't spoken to yet. Staff Sergeant Tomas Ruiz, Army, broad and quiet, with the kind of deliberate stillness that came from experience rather than disposition. He had a scar along his left jaw that was old enough to have gone silvery, and he moved through the circuit with the same studied competence that Maya recognized as a fellow professional operating below their actual ceiling. "You did fine," he said, not looking at her, running his fingers along the quick releases on his rig. "Not just now, generally." She glanced at him. He hadn't spoken to her directly before this. "Thanks. I noticed them watching you," he said. Same flat voice, still not looking at her. "Pierce and his boys." She kept her hands on her own gear. "I noticed. There's a word for it," he said. "What they do." "I know the word. Base knows too." He pulled a strap through and cinched it. "Most of them figure it's above their pay grade to do anything about it." "Is that what you figure?" she said. He finally looked at her. He had the kind of eyes that didn't perform. They just looked. "I figure if I saw something that was worth seeing, I'd remember it." He paused. "That's all I'm saying." He walked away before she could respond. She watched him go. Filed it. Ruiz, Thomas, Army, SSG. Third position in the recovery circle. Approximately 6 years of service visible in his bearing, potential witness, approach with care. She would not push him. She would not need to. If Ruiz had already decided that what he was watching was worth remembering, then Ruiz was already doing the work on his own terms, which was the most reliable kind. Well, The shift came on the afternoon of day 5, and Maya almost missed the significance of it because it came quietly. She was finishing a radio calibration exercise in the northern training bay when she saw Logan Pierce watching her from across the field. Not in the way he had watched her before, not the assessing, predatory patience of the first 3 days. This was different. He was standing with his arms crossed, slightly apart from Cole and Knox, and he was watching her the way someone watches a situation they are reconsidering. She worked through the radio exercise, frequency checks, channel confirmations, authentication codes called out to the range controller, and felt his attention on her back like a physical weight. When she turned at one point to move to the next station, she caught his face directly for a moment. He looked like a man doing arithmetic. She recognized that expression from 2 other operational contexts in her career, both of them involving subjects who had begun to sense, not through evidence, not through anything concrete, that a situation was not what they had taken it to be. It was a pre-verbal intuition, the kind that came from the accumulation of small wrongnesses. She hadn't responded to pressure the way the pattern predicted. She had disabled Knox faster than any untrained person should have been able to. She had looked at Hale when he walked in without the micro-flinch that fear produced. Small things, not enough to name, but enough to make him uncomfortable. She turned away from his gaze and finished the radio exercise. She handed the equipment back to the range controller and signed off the completion form with the unremarkable signature of a woman named Integration Officer Calloway. That evening, she doubled the frequency of her recording equipment checks, just in case. It was Knox who came to her that night, not Logan, not Cole. Knox alone, which was a configuration she hadn't anticipated, and which told her the dynamic within the group had shifted in ways she needed to think carefully about. He found her outside the barracks in the narrow strip of covered walkway where people went to sit without quite being inside. She had her back against the wall, a water bottle in her hand, letting the last of the day's heat settle out. The desert smelled like dust and something faintly mineral, the smell of a place that had been baked too long. Knox sat down on the bench at the other end of the walkway, about 12 feet away. He sat with his hands between his knees, looking at the ground, and he said nothing for a minute and a half. She waited. "My wrist is fine," he said finally. "I know," she said. Another pause. "You've had training." "Everyone on this base has had training," she said. "Not that kind." He looked up at her. He was younger than she'd kept reminding herself, 24, maybe 25, still carrying a little of the unfinished quality of men who were in the process of becoming something and had made bad choices about whose hands to put that process in. His face in the low evening light looked less certain than it did when he was in the corridor with the other 2. "Where?" "Does it matter?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not what you look like," he said. "No one is," she said. "I mean—" He stopped, rubbed his hand across the back of his neck. "Logan's been doing this for a while, and it never—" He stopped again. "No one ever—" "Just say it," she said. "You didn't act like someone who was scared," he said. "You acted like someone who was waiting." The wind moved through the creosote somewhere beyond the building. A security light clicked on at the far end of the walkway and buzzed softly. Maya looked at him and decided in the space of approximately 2 seconds what this moment was and what it required. Knox was not coming to her with remorse. It was too early for remorse, and he wasn't the type to arrive at it cleanly. He was coming to her with unease, with the specific discomfort of a person who has done a thing that worked smoothly every previous time and is unsettled by the first instance where it didn't. There was a version of this conversation where she could push him, carefully, slowly, towards something that would later be useful in a deposition. A statement he made voluntarily. An admission of awareness. But she needed to be careful. Knox on his own was not the primary target. Knox rattled, and talking to Logan about what he'd noticed could accelerate the timeline in a direction she hadn't fully prepared for. "Get some sleep," she said. He looked at her. Then he nodded. A small, compressed movement that carried more in it than agreement, almost like a decision being made. He stood up, walked back inside, and the walkway door closed behind him. Maya sat for another few minutes in the quiet. Then she pulled out the encrypted burner and sent Delaron a message. "Knox is unsettled. Pierce may be reconsidering approach. Possible acceleration. Monitor for contact between Pierce and Hale." She put the burner away and finished her water. Above the base, the Nevada sky was doing the thing it did at this hour, going from deep purple to a black so complete it made the stars look structural, like they were holding something up rather than just burning in it. She had slept under skies like this in places where the silence meant something more specific and more dangerous, and she had learned to use the quiet as a resource rather than a discomfort. She went inside. Tomorrow was day 6. The message from the off-base team came at 03:55, 3 hours before first formation. She read it on the burner in the dark of the barracks. Screen brightness turned all the way down, the phone angled toward the wall. Intercept from monitoring. Pierce made 2 calls tonight after lights out. First to a number registered to the base administrative network. Cross-reference shows the line runs through Hale's duty office, non-direct extension. Second to an unregistered cell. Call duration, 11 minutes. Unable to capture audio on second call, encryption on the other end suggests personal device with third-party app. Working on trace. She read it twice, 11 minutes. Logan Pierce was on the phone for 11 minutes with someone on an encrypted private line at 200 in the morning, and the call came after Knox had sat on that walkway and told her she didn't act like someone who was scared. She lay back on her bunk and stared at the ceiling. The operation had been designed around a specific behavioral prediction, that Pierce and his group would continue to escalate in a pattern consistent with their prior behavior, that they would create a second confrontation, and that the second confrontation would be sufficiently documented to serve as the cornerstone of the formal case. That prediction was based on 12 prior incidents in the file, on behavioral analysis provided by a contracted forensic psychologist who had spent 40 hours reviewing the documented pattern, and on Maya's own operational assessment after 3 days on the ground. What the prediction had not accounted for was the possibility that Logan Pierce, at some point in the process, would pick up a phone and call someone for guidance, which meant someone outside the immediate group might be more actively involved in the decision-making than the file had suggested, which meant the next move might not look like what she expected it to look like. She ran the contingency options. She mapped the scenarios where the operation could be compromised, not from outside, not from a security breach on the technical side, but from a change in the target's behavior that the operation's structure hadn't been built to handle. She found 3 scenarios that concerned her. She found one that concerned her significantly more than the others. The most dangerous outcome was not another confrontation in a corridor. The most dangerous outcome was if Pierce, or whoever he had spoken to for 11 minutes, decided that the cleanest solution was to make Maya disappear from the base before a second confrontation could happen. A complaint filed against her. A performance assessment that created grounds for early integration termination. Something administrative and clean, processed through Hale's authority, that put her on a vehicle off Iron Ridge before the operation had everything it needed. She had 48 hours of documented evidence. It was good evidence, but it wasn't enough without the second confrontation, without a physical escalation on record that gave the formal case an anchor point solid enough to survive the military legal process. She needed to stay on this base. She needed Pierce to make his next move before he was given the advice to stop making moves altogether. She closed her eyes and spent the next 2 hours running the problem with the specific, tireless patience that had been the most useful thing anyone had ever taught her. The patience that didn't feel like waiting, but like working. By 05:30, when the first formation lights came on across the barracks, she had a revised plan. It was not the plan she had come to Iron Ridge with, but it was the plan that the situation required, and she had learned a long time ago that the difference between those 2 things was exactly where most operations either adapted or collapsed. She got up, laced her boots, rolled her shoulders once, feeling the familiar resistance of muscle and scar tissue that had accumulated across 15 years of doing things that left marks. She walked out into the pre-dawn dark and waited for the day to start. The revised plan had 3 components, and she ran all 3 simultaneously starting at 0600. The first was visibility. She stopped performing mediocrity. Not dramatically. She didn't suddenly post the fastest runtime or put Knox on the ground during a combative drill to make a point. That kind of reversal was theatrical, and theatrical was wrong for what she needed. What she did instead was stop hiding the edges. During the morning firearms qualification, she shot clean. Not perfectly, because nobody shoots perfectly, but with the controlled consistency of someone who had been shooting for a very long time and had stopped needing to think about it. She transitioned between positions without the manufactured hesitation of the previous days. When the range controller called her score, he paused for a half second before writing it down, which meant he hadn't expected it. That was fine. She wasn't hiding from the range controller. She was being seen by the right people in the right way. The second component was documentation acceleration. She sent a compressed status report to Delaran during the mid-morning break, outlining the 11-minute call, her assessment of the timeline risk, and her revised approach. His response came back in 6 minutes. Understood. 2 additional investigators repositioning to forward staging point by 1400. Response window compressed to 45 seconds on your signal. Stand by. The third component was Abby Lawson. This was the one she'd thought hardest about in those 2 pre-dawn hours because it carried the most risk of the 3. Not physical risk, but the kind that was harder to manage. The risk of moving too fast with someone who was still deciding whether trust was worth the cost. She found Abby during the mid-morning water break, in the same covered walkway from the night before. Abby was sitting with her back against the wall, helmet in her lap, sweat drying on her face. She looked tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. Maya sat down beside her. Not across. Beside. You said you watched it happen to 3 other women, Maya said. No preamble. Abby looked at her sideways. Yeah. Do you remember their names? A pause. Something moved in Abby's expression. A kind of recalibration, like she was reassessing what kind of question this was. Why? Because names matter, Maya said, and because if someone were building something that needed names, I'd want them to have the right ones. The silence that followed was the kind where someone does a significant amount of deciding. Abby looked at the training field for a long moment, at the soldiers moving through drills in the morning heat, at the routine discipline of the place, at everything that looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. Martinez, she said finally. Reyes. And a woman named Faust. I don't know her first name. She was gone before I got here. Someone told me about her. Do you have contact information for any of them? Abby looked at her directly. Who are you? Someone who's trying to make sure the thing that happened to them doesn't just keep happening, Maya said. That's all I can tell you right now, but I need you to trust that it means something. Abby held for a long moment. Her jaw was tight. Martinez transferred to Lejeune. I have her email from a unit distribution list. She paused. Reyes, I don't know. She left fast. Martinez is enough, Maya said. What are you going to do with it? Use it the right way, Maya said. At the right time. Abby looked at her for another moment. Then she seemed to make a decision that involved accepting an uncertainty she wasn't comfortable with, which was its own kind of courage. She took out her phone, pulled up a contact, and read Maya an email address. Maya memorized it. She had learned years ago not to write things down unless she had to, and she didn't have to. If this goes sideways, Abby said, if it somehow gets back to him that It won't, Maya said. Not for me. That's not nothing, Abby said, but it's also not a guarantee. No, Maya agreed. It's not. Abby nodded slowly. She put her phone away and looked back at the training field. He's going to make another move, she said. Not a question. Probably, Maya said. On you? That's the idea. Abby was quiet for a moment. You're letting him. Maya didn't answer that. Jesus, Abby said under her breath. The reflexive kind. No intent behind it. Just the word people reach for when something clicks into place that's larger than they expected. Then she caught herself and looked at Maya with an expression that was complicated and probably accurate. You've done this before. Get some rest when you can, Maya said. It might be a long couple of days. She stood up and walked back into the morning. Day 6 moved differently than the days before it. There was a quality to the base that she hadn't felt in the first 5 days. A specific atmospheric pressure, the kind that has nothing to do with weather. She noticed it in small things. Logan Pierce arrived at formation 2 minutes late, which he never did, and his face carried the compressed expression of someone who had been in a conversation they were still processing. Cole Mercer was quieter than usual, which was saying something, because Cole Mercer's default was already stripped close to silence. Knox avoided her completely. No proximity, No eye contact, not even the ambient tracking that everyone does in a shared space. He was actively not looking at her, which was its own kind of looking. Hale did a walkthrough of the training field at 0930. He didn't stop to speak with the integration group, but he walked the full perimeter of the field at a measured pace, and once, briefly, professionally, with no readable expression, his gaze passed across Maya's position and moved on. She let it move on. The morning training evolution was a force-on-force exercise in a simulated urban environment, a collection of plywood and concrete structures on the south end of the installation that the base used for room-clearing drills, movement to contact, and close-quarters decision-making exercises. The integration group was divided into opposing elements, red force and blue force, with the blue element tasked with clearing a sequence of structures while red force occupied and defended. Maya drew blue force third position in a four-person stack. The exercise controller ran through the ROE, training weapons only, no live fire, mandatory marker system for simulated casualties, and then released both elements to their starting positions. The four-person stack assembled at the first building's entry point. The lead was a Marine corporal named Trevino, who knew what he was doing, and the second position was the Army specialist Maya had sparred with on day 2. She was third. Fourth was a Navy technical specialist who had been navigating the entire integration period with the specific out-of-water energy of someone who spent most of their career in a server room. "Stack is solid," Trevino said, low. "We move on my call. First room is a lobby structure, probable 2-point. Clear left, clear right, consolidate center. Got it?" Confirmation from all three. He moved. The entry was clean. 2 training opponents inside, both tagged within the first 8 seconds. Trevino called the consolidation and they pushed to the second structure. It was in the third structure that the exercise changed. The room layout was a long central corridor with 4 doors off it, a design specifically intended to test decision-making under branching threat conditions. Trevino went first with the specialist. Maya and the Navy tech held the entry while the first 2 worked the corridor. Through the entry, she heard movement from a room that the exercise layout hadn't flagged as occupied. A scrape of boot sole against concrete. Not the training tempo movement of someone waiting to play their assigned role in the drill. Something more purposeful. She held position. Listened. Another movement. 2 distinct footsteps, inconsistent with a single occupant. She glanced back at the Navy tech, who had heard it too and was looking at her with the expression of someone waiting to be told what to think about it. 3 room, she said quietly. 2 in it, not ours. Could be the cadre, he said. Cadre doesn't move like that, she said. She pushed the door with her offhand, keeping her training weapon up. Logan Pierce was standing at the back of the room. Cole Mercer was at the window. There was no exercise controller with them, no marker system on their vests. They were not part of the force-on-force evolution. They were inside the training structure during an active exercise drill, which violated the exercise protocols in ways that were both technically significant and, in the context of what Maya understood about why they were here, not surprising at all. The room smelled like old concrete and something chemical from the marker rounds. The light coming through the window was sharp and angled, casting half of Logan's face in shadow. "Wrong building," Maya said. "I don't think so," Logan said. She ran the situation fast. Trevino and the specialist were 2 structures ahead, out of earshot. The Navy tech was behind her, partial view of the room, no combat instinct to fall back on. The exercise was running active, which meant the noise of the drill outside would cover sounds from inside this structure for at least another 8 minutes. And her recording equipment was active. She had verified it at 04:45 that morning and again at 08:30. "This is an active exercise area," she said. "You need to clear out. We're having a conversation," Logan said. His voice was different today. The warmth from the first days was gone completely. What was underneath it was not rage. Rage was easier to manage than this. It was a kind of cold specificity, the voice of someone who had made a decision and was now implementing it. "We've been watching you since yesterday. The way you moved on the range this morning, the way you shoot, the way you handled Ethan in the corridor." He tilted his head slightly. "None of that is what you put on your integration file." "People improve," she said. "Not that fast." He took 1 step forward. "So here's what I think. I think you're not who you say you are, and I think that's a problem." If you have a concern about my credentials, there's a proper channel. I'm not interested in channels, he said. I'm interested in understanding what's going on before it becomes something I can't manage. Logan, Cole's voice from the window. Low, warning. I've got it, Logan said, without looking back. Maya held her position. She calculated angles, distances, response windows. The Navy tech behind her was not an asset. He was a liability. Because he was unpredictable and untrained, and if this escalated in the wrong direction, he might do something that complicated the documentation. She needed him out of the room. Hey, she said, without turning her head. Rejoin the element. Tell Trevino I'm handling a comms issue. I don't think I should. Go, she said. Quiet. Absolute. The voice she used when there was no second version of the instruction. He went. The door behind her closed. The room was quieter. Logan watched her. The expression on his face had the quality of a man conducting an interview, which was almost interesting. Even now, even here, he framed what he was doing as a kind of management. You want to tell me who sent you? He said. No one sent me, she said. I made some calls last night, he said. I have a friend who runs background checks at a level most people don't get access to. Your service file is clean, too clean. He paused. People with your kind of reflexes don't have service files that clean. It means something got scrubbed. She said nothing. So either you're a reporter, he said the word like it tasted bad, or you're federal, or you're something else. He looked at her steadily. Which is it? I'm Immigration Officer Calloway, she said. That's what my credentials say. Right, he said. Then, Cole. Cole moved away from the window. She was already adjusting her stance when he moved. Weight shifted back, knees unlocked, hands dropping to a ready position that looked like nothing unless you knew what you were looking at. Cole was bigger than Knox, significantly bigger. He moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone who had used his size as a weapon, often enough that it had become automatic, and his trajectory was direct. The bull rush line of a man who intended to use momentum and mass to end the conversation physically before it went any further. He closed the distance in 3 steps. She sidestepped at the last possible moment. Not a dodge, a redirect, using the angle of his own momentum to pull instead of push, pivoting on her lead foot and applying pressure to his extended arm in the specific way that turned forward velocity into a downward spiral. He went hard into the wall to her left, shoulder first, and she heard the sound of his breath leaving him on impact. He did not go down. He was too heavy and too stubborn and too accustomed to things not going the way they should. And he bounced off the wall and turned back toward her with blood starting from a split along his eyebrow where the concrete had caught it. Don't, she said. He came again. This time she gave him the arm he was reaching for. Let him grip it. Let him think for a half second that he had it. And use that half second to step inside his reach, drive her elbow into his solar plexus, and as the air left him a second time, take the grip he had on her arm and turn it over her shoulder in a come-along that bent him forward and down. She held him there, one arm cranked behind him at an angle that would dislocate the shoulder if he tried to straighten, his weight forward and unrecoverable. He made a sound that was mostly involuntary. I said don't, she said. She released him and stepped back. He stayed bent, hands on his knees, breathing. Logan hadn't moved. He was standing exactly where he'd been, and his face had gone through a sequence of expressions in the last 30 seconds that she had watched the edge of in her peripheral vision. Surprise, then something that was almost calculation again, then something else. Something she hadn't seen on his face before. Last chance, she said. Walk out of this room, both of you, right now. Logan looked at her for a long moment. You know what happens to people who make problems at this installation, he said. They go away. I know exactly what happens to them, she said. I've read their files, all 12 of them. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. Logan went very still. 12, he repeated. Martinez, Reyes, Faust. She held his gaze. Do you want me to keep going? He stared at her. She watched his face change for the 3rd time, and what it changed into was not anger and not calculation. It was something rawer and less managed than either of those. The look of a man whose entire architecture of safety, the network of protections he had built and used and relied on for over a decade, suddenly felt less certain than it had 5 minutes ago. "You have no idea what you're in," he said. His voice was quieter. "Hale has friends, real ones, not the kind you manage with an investigation." "I know about his friends," she said. "I know what calls he's made. I know what extensions he's used." She let that land. "And I know about the 11 minutes you spent on an encrypted line last night at 0200. The blood drained from his face. It was the first time she had seen that happen to him, and it was not satisfying in the way she had once imagined it would be. It was just information. Confirmation that the leverage was real and that he understood it was real, which was what she needed from this moment. "This is over," she said. Not heated, just factual. "However you thought this was going to go, it's over. What happens next depends entirely on whether you make it worse." He did not respond. Cole was upright again, leaning against the wall, holding his arm at the shoulder. His face was blank, but his eyes were doing the recalculating that Maya had seen on Logan the previous afternoon. The arithmetic of a situation that had stopped adding up. She walked to the room door, pushed it open. Sunlight from the corridor came in sharp and concrete white. "Logan," she said, without turning back, "don't make another call tonight." She walked out. She rejoined the exercise 2 structures ahead, fell back into position behind Trevino without explanation, and completed the remaining 8 minutes of the force-on-force evolution with the functional precision of someone who had not just been in a room alone with 2 people who had decided she was a problem to be managed. When the exercise concluded and the debrief circle formed around the controller, she stood in it and gave her elements after action the same way she always did: clear, specific, minimal. The Navy tech stood across the circle from her and did not meet her eyes, which she noted but did not address. She sent Dellerin a message during the equipment cleanup. "Second contact complete. Force-on-force training structure. South compound. Pierce confirmed surveillance awareness. He knows something is off. Cole Mercer. Possible shoulder injury from response non-serious. Hail contact likely within the next 6 hours. Recommend activating response team now." Dellerin's response came in 4 minutes. "Team is moving. Command element is read in. Timing is yours." She put the burner away. She had 2 things she needed to do before the operation moved to its final phase. The first was to reach Ruiz. She found him in the vehicle staging area at 1600, running a maintenance check on a transport truck with the focused attention of someone who preferred mechanical problems to human ones. She walked up beside him and crouched down to look at the same wheel assembly he was looking at. "You said you'd remember things worth remembering," she said. He kept his hands on the wheel assembly. "I said that." "Day 4, Eastern Corridor, Building 4. Were you near there?" A pause. "I did an equipment check in Building 4 that morning." "Eastern section?" Another pause. "I walked through." She looked at the wheel. "If someone asked you what you saw and asked you to make a formal statement about it, would you be willing to do that?" Ruiz was quiet for a long moment. He ran a thumb along the edge of the wheel rim. Then he said, "What I saw was a 3-on-1 situation in a confined space where somebody didn't want to be, and I kept walking because I didn't understand what I was seeing until later." He stopped. "I've regretted it since about noon that day." "You can fix that," she said. He looked at her, not with the calculating look of someone evaluating risk, with the look of someone who had been waiting for this specific sentence. "Tell me when," he said. "I'll find you," she said. She straightened up and walked back toward the main compound. 8. The second thing she needed to do was harder, and she sat with it through the evening meal and the subsequent gear maintenance period, and the quiet first hour after lights out, working through the edges of it, the way you work through something you've decided but haven't yet made yourself do. She needed to call Diane Westmore. Colonel Westmore was retired now, had been for 4 years, which was a circumstance that had involved a great deal of institutional resistance and exactly 0 personal regret on Westmore's part. She ran a small consulting firm out of Fredericksburg, Virginia, that did the kind of work the military trusted her with precisely because she had spent 32 years doing it from the inside. She and Maya spoke 3 or 4 times a year, and the calls were never social, not exactly, though they weren't professional either. They were something in the middle. The kind of connection between 2 people who had been through versions of the same thing and had figured out different ways to survive it. Maya had not told Westmore about Iron Ridge. The operation was compartmentalized. She wasn't required to. But Westmore knew Pierce's name from the Fort Calloway adjacent cases 9 years back. when she had been working a parallel investigation that had never fully closed. She had a contact at the JAG office who was now a senior attorney on the military legal team that would handle prosecution. And she had, in 4 decades of navigating institutional systems, developed a set of relationships with oversight bodies that Maya's own unit could not easily access. If Pierce had made contact last night with someone outside the base, and if that someone was moving to do something administrative, a complaint against Maya, an early termination of her integration rotation, she needed a countermove that could be initiated quickly and without going through channels that Hale could influence. She pulled out the burner, stared at the screen for a moment. Then she dialed. Westmore answered on the second ring. It was 21:30 in Nevada, which meant it was 00:30 in Virginia, and her voice sounded like someone who hadn't been asleep yet, rather than someone who had been woken up. She had always been like that, a late-thinking person who did her best work when the day had stopped demanding things of her. "I'm at a place I can't name," Maya said. "I need a 20-minute hold on a JAG contact you have." "Which case?" "Can't say yet. But it connects to something you worked 9 years ago, Fort Calloway adjacent." A pause. "How close?" "Center mass," Maya said. Westmore was quiet for about 4 seconds. Then, "Is this about to move fast?" "Could be in the next 48 hours. "All right." The sound of movement on the other end. Westmore getting up from wherever she'd been, going somewhere more private. "What do you need from the JAG side?" A standing brief. "Someone read in enough that when documentation comes through, they're not starting cold, and someone who is not reachable through the command structure at the installation I'm at." "That I can do," Westmore said. "Give me until 0800 your time." "Thank you," Maya said. "Don't thank me," Westmore said. "Just make sure it's enough to stick." "I intend to," Maya said. She ended the call. Through the thin wall of the barracks, she could hear the distant sound of boots on the walkway outside, the security patrol making its 2,200 pass. She listened to it come and go, the rhythm of it, the way it faded back into the desert silence. She had one more night to let the pressure build. One more night before the thing that had been set in motion for 4 years, that had been set in motion, if she was honest, for 15, finally arrived at the point it had always been moving toward. She closed her eyes. Somewhere across the base, Logan Pierce was in his bunk, or at his desk, or standing at a window, running the same arithmetic she had watched start on his face in that training structure. The kind of arithmetic that has no clean answer, only a set of diminishing options, and a growing understanding that the situation has moved past the point where it can be managed from the inside. She had read his file. She knew how he handled that feeling. She knew what it made him do. It made him move too fast. And she was ready for that. She lay still in the dark and let the night pass around her, and she thought about 12 women who had sat in their own bunks in their own dark rooms on this installation and had not known that anyone was coming. That the thing they had learned to carry alone was being measured and documented and built into something that a system built to protect the people who hurt them would not be able to dismantle. They hadn't known, but it was true anyway. She fell asleep at 22:47 and woke at 04:10. Which gave her everything she needed and no more than that, which had always been enough. She was on her second cup of bad coffee at the operations vehicle when Delaran called at 04:37. "Pierce filed a complaint at 0300, he said. "No greeting, no preamble. Against you, submitted through the base administrative system to Hale's office, alleges unprofessional conduct, physical aggression during a training exercise, and this is the interesting part, falsification of integration credentials." Maya set down the coffee cup. "He moved fast." "Moved faster than I expected," Delaran said, "which means whoever he called 2 nights ago told him to move fast. This wasn't his idea. The language in the complaint is too clean. Someone helped him write it." "Hale? Or Hale's people?" The complaint was processed and flagged for command review by 0330. That's 30 minutes after submission. Even automated systems don't move that fast without someone pushing them. She looked out through the vehicle's windshield at the pre-dawn dark. The base perimeter lights made orange pools in the dust. What does command review mean in practice? It means Hale has grounds to initiate an administrative hold on your integration status pending investigation. which means he can put you on a vehicle out of Iron Ridge today before 0800 and frame it as routine procedural compliance. Can he make that stick? For long enough, Delloran said. Long enough to get you off base before we have everything we need. His legal team would contest the federal mandate. They'd claim the complaint creates a conflict of interest in the investigation and requires your removal from the installation pending review. That process takes 6 to 8 weeks, and 6 to 8 weeks means this case freezes, witnesses scatter, and we start over with nothing that a court-martial board will hold together. Maya was quiet for a moment. The coffee was going cold in the cup. He's good, she said, not admiringly, just accurately. He's been doing this for 30 years, Delloran said. He's had a long time to figure out the exits. What's our window? If you can give me a second confrontation with physical documentation before 0730, I can use the federal mandate to override the administrative hold. It has to be on record before Hale initiates the removal. Once he files the paperwork through the command network, it triggers an automatic stay on all related activity pending the JAG review. We need to be ahead of the paperwork. 2 hours and 50 minutes, she said. 2 hours and 50 minutes, he confirmed. And Maya, I need it to be clean, not just documented. Clean enough that when their legal team spends the next year trying to pull it apart, there's nothing that moves. I know, she said. You can't put anyone in the hospital. I wasn't planning to put anyone in the hospital. Cole Mercer's shoulder is sore, she said. Not dislocated. He'll be fine. A pause on Delloran's end. How do you want to play this? She had been thinking about that since the conversation with Knox on the walkway, since the 11-minute phone call, since the moment in the training structure when she had watched Logan's face change and understood that he was the kind of man who responded to threat by escalating rather than retreating. She had known this moment was coming. She had planned for it, mapped it, built contingencies around it. The only variable she hadn't fully controlled was the timing. Now the timing was controlling her. I'm going to make myself easy to find, she said. Pierce is going to want to resolve this before the complaint gets complicated. He's not going to wait for Hale to do it administratively. He's going to want to do something himself, something that makes the complaint look like the follow-up rather than the opening move. That's how he thinks. You're sure? She thought about the file, about 12 women, about the way Logan Pierce had looked at her across that training structure when she'd named Martinez and Reyes and Faust. She thought about the 11-minute phone call, which had not been Logan Pierce reaching out to a lawyer. She knew the difference between a person calling legal counsel and a person calling someone who made problems go away, and what Logan Pierce had done at 0200 was the second thing. I'm sure, she said, have the response team in position at the Eastern Compound, Building 4, the same corridor. A pause. You want to use the same location. The surveillance infrastructure there is the strongest, and he knows I've been in that corridor. He'll think it's a vulnerability. She paused. Let him think that. 60 seconds from your signal, Delloran said. Make it 45, she said, given the timeline. 45, he agreed. Be careful. I will, she said. She put the phone away and finished the cold coffee because she'd learned a long time ago to use whatever fuel was available regardless of whether it was good. Sad. She was in the eastern corridor of Building 4 at 0521. She'd arranged it the same way as before. A made-up maintenance requirement, a form submitted the night before through the integration administrative system, a documented legitimate reason to be in the building at that hour. The pre-positioned surveillance equipment was fully active. She had done a final check at 0510 and received confirmation from the off-base relay team on all 9 feeds. She opened her equipment locker and began a secondary inventory. Her hands were steady. She had noticed years ago that her hands steadied when things got close, which was the inverse of what most people experienced and which she had long since stopped trying to explain or understand. It was just the way she was built, or the way she'd rebuilt herself over 15 years of doing things that required the hands to be reliable even when everything else was uncertain. She heard the door at 0538, one set of footsteps. Only one. She hadn't expected that, and the part of her mind that processed tactical variables ran the recalculation fast. Pierce alone changed the geometry of the confrontation. Not the physical geometry. One person was simpler than 3. But the legal geometry, the documentation geometry. She needed behavior on record, and behavior in groups had a different character than behavior alone. Alone, a person could more easily claim confusion, misunderstanding, the absence of intent. She kept her hands on the inventory. Let him come to her. He stopped about 8 feet back. She turned around. Logan Pierce looked like a man who had not slept in the way that strips something from the face, not just the puffiness or the dull eyes, but the managed presentation, the careful construction that people maintain between themselves and the world when they're performing a version of themselves they've decided to be. He looked like what he actually was, which, in her professional assessment, was a frightened man trying very hard not to look like a frightened man. "You filed a complaint," she said. "You assaulted one of my Marines," he said. Ethan Knox pressed a training blade against my uniform in an unmonitored corridor with 2 other personnel blocking the exits. I removed the threat. She looked at him calmly. "You know that's what happened. You were there. My account of what happened is different from yours." "I know," she said. "That's why there are other accounts." He stared at her. "What other accounts?" "The kind that don't change based on who's asking," she said. Something shifted in his face, not dramatically, just a tightening around the jaw, a slight compression of the mouth. He had come here expecting a specific kind of confrontation, the kind he had run before, and she was not giving it to him. "You need to withdraw from this installation," he said. "Today, before this gets complicated." "Define complicated," she said. "Hale is reviewing your credentials this morning. There are questions about your file, inconsistencies in your service record, your training history." He paused, and the pause was calculated, meant to land. People who show up at installations with scrubbed service files don't tend to come out of those reviews well. "What do you think I am?" she said. "I think you're federal," he said. "I think you've been sent here to build a case, and I think you've been operating under false pretenses for 6 days. And I think that when Hale puts that in writing this morning, your operation, whatever it is, loses its legal standing on this installation." He paused again. "So I'm giving you the same thing you gave me yesterday. One chance. Leave today, voluntarily, and whatever you've built here doesn't get challenged through the JAG system for the next 8 weeks. She looked at him. "Pierce," she said, "I'm going to show you something, and I need you to pay close attention." She reached into her left cargo pocket, slowly, deliberately, with no sudden movement, and produced a credentials case that was not the one she had been carrying for 6 days. She opened it and held it out toward him. He looked at the credentials. The color left his face for the second time in 2 days, and this time it went faster. Special Operations Command. Federal Investigative Authority. A case number that corresponded to a federal mandate filed 4 months ago under a statute that granted investigative access to any military installation in the continental United States without prior notification to base command. He stared at it long enough that she knew he was reading it twice. "You don't have grounds," he said. But the certainty had gone out of his voice, and what was left sounded like a man repeating something he'd been told rather than something he believed. "I have 6 days of documentation," she said. "Physical contact, verbal threats, a training blade used against a federal officer operating undercover, and a senior officer who walked into an active situation and said, 'Carry on.'" She put the credentials away. "I also have your phone records from last night, and Hale's." The corridor was very quiet. The fluorescent at the far end buzzed. "You should call your lawyer," she said. "A real one, not whoever you talked to at 0200. He was still for a long moment. Then something in him that had been tightly controlled for the last 6 days, maybe for much longer than that, seemed to reach its limit. His face didn't crumple. Men like Logan Pierce didn't crumple, but it hardened in a different direction, went from the performance of authority to something rawer and meaner. "You think this ends here," he said. "You think a federal case file ends 3 decades of—" He stopped, caught himself. Too much of the sentence was already out. "3 decades, she said. "Go ahead and finish it." His jaw tightened. "That's on record too," she said. The sound came from behind him. The corridor entrance, the door pushing open with the pneumatic hiss she'd been listening for. She didn't look. She kept her eyes on Logan Pierce and watched his face as the sound of multiple sets of boots entered the corridor. He turned. Agent Delloran was first through the door, badge out, with two federal investigators behind him and a military police officer beside them. Behind the MP, Ruiz, Staff Sergeant Tomas Ruiz, Army, who had been positioned at the corridor entrance as a documented independent witness since 05:15, which was 12 minutes before Maya had entered the building. Logan Pierce, Delloran said. His voice was flat and professional and had the specific quality of someone who had been doing this long enough that it no longer gave him any satisfaction, and he did it anyway. I'm Agent Delloran, Federal Investigative Services. You're being formally notified that you are the subject of an active federal investigation under mandate. He read the case number. You have the right to counsel before making any statements. Do you understand? Pierce looked at Delloran, then at the MP, then slowly back at Maya. She said nothing. This is not over, he said to her. Quiet. Personal. Stripped of the management, the warmth, all of it. No, she agreed. It's just starting. The next 6 hours were the kind that don't look like anything from the outside. No dramatic arrests, no shouting in hallways. The way these things actually worked, the real version, not the version that gets written up in after-action summaries by people who weren't there, was procedural. It was paperwork and secure phone calls and a sequence of rooms where people sat across tables from each other and either talked or didn't. Logan Pierce sat in an administrative conference room with a JAG-assigned defense attorney who had been contacted through proper channels and arrived at 08:30 looking harassed and undercaffeinated. Pierce said nothing after his initial notification. He sat with his arms crossed and his face set in the expression of someone waiting for a situation to change through sheer unwillingness to accept it, which was its own kind of information about the kind of man he was. Cole Mercer was located in the Eastern Barracks and formally notified at 06:49. He had more questions than Pierce, asked about the process, the timeline, the specific allegations, which Delloran answered in the standard way, which was to say, carefully and minimally. Mercer's shoulder was assessed by the base medical officer at 07:15. Bruised, partially strained, not dislocated. He would put in a medical statement about how the injury occurred. Delloran flagged the statement for the case file. Knox was the hardest part of the morning. He had been sitting outside his barracks room when the investigators arrived, which meant he had been awake since before they came, which meant he had known something was moving. He stood up when Delloran approached, and before Delloran could begin the formal notification, he said, "I want to talk." Delloran looked at him. "You understand that anything you say—" "I know," Knox said. "I want to talk anyway." He was interviewed for 2 hours and 20 minutes in a separate room, with a recorder running and a federal attorney present. Maya was not in the room. She had been moved to a different section of the base by 700, standard protocol once the active phase of the operation initiated, to prevent any claim of witness contact or evidence contamination. She didn't know what Knox said in that room. She wouldn't know for several days. What she did know, because Delloran told her in a brief at 1100, was that the interview had produced something that significantly expanded the scope of what they had. "He gave us 2 names," Delloran said. "Not Pierce, not Mercer. 2 names from prior installations. Personnel who were involved in similar situations before Iron Ridge. One of them is currently stationed at a base in Georgia. The other separated from service 14 months ago. He gave those up voluntarily," she said. "Completely. No deal offered. No deal requested." Delloran paused. "He also gave us a description of at least 2 additional incidents here at Iron Ridge that weren't in our file. Victims he's aware of who never made formal contact with anyone." She thought about that. About the 12 in the file becoming 14, 16, more. About the shape of the thing expanding the way it always expanded when you finally got someone on the inside talking, and how the expansion was never surprising and always heavy. "What about the 2 from other installations?" she said. "Can they be contacted?" "We're working on it." She nodded. "And Hale?" Delloran's expression changed. A small compression, the look of someone managing a complicated piece of news. "Hale's situation is more involved than we initially assessed," he said. "When we executed the warrant on his administrative files this morning, we found documentation that suggests his role wasn't passive oversight. He was actively redirecting complaint submissions. Not just failing to act on them, redirecting them. There's a parallel filing system in his office, separate from the official complaint registry, that contains originals of documents that were supposed to have been routed through normal channels and show up in the system as never received. She looked at him. He's been maintaining a shadow complaint record for at least 6 years, Delaran said. The originals, which means he knew exactly what was being reported, and he was keeping the originals as, we're not sure yet, insurance maybe, leverage, or just the habit of a man who never expected to be found out and wanted to keep score. He kept them, she said. Not a question, more like something she needed to say out loud to verify it was real. 37 complaints, Delaran said. Originals, dating back to his second year at Iron Ridge. She sat with that number for a moment. 37 people who had reported something. 37 pieces of paper that had been taken out of the system and put in a filing cabinet in a man's office and left there where they couldn't do anything, where they were just evidence of something that no one would ever act on. Or so he had believed. He's going to need a very good attorney, she said. He's already made calls, Delaran said. His attorney arrived at 09:30. Very good. Very expensive. He paused. Not good enough. The formal debrief happened at 1400 in a conference room in the main administrative building, and it was not the kind of debrief where anyone was particularly comfortable. There were 8 people in the room: Maya, Delaran, 2 federal investigators, a senior military attorney from the JAG office who had flown in from the West Coast on a morning flight, a 2-star general named Harwick, who commanded the regional training complex and had been woken at 0445 with a phone call that had clearly not improved his view of the morning, and 2 aides whose function was primarily documentary. General Harwick was a compact, gray-haired man with the specific quality of someone who had been in institutional authority long enough to have absorbed both its power and its responsibility with equal heaviness. He didn't look pleased. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had been handed a very large, very complicated problem and was in the process of determining exactly how large and complicated it was before deciding how he felt about it. He looked at Maya's credentials for approximately 45 seconds before setting them on the table. How long has this operation been running? He said. Active phase, 6 days, she said. Preparatory phase, 4 months. And my office wasn't notified. The federal mandate doesn't require command notification, the JAG attorney said from the end of the table. Her name was Colonel Sandra Oakes, and she had the precise economy of someone who had spent a career turning legal complexity into short sentences. The investigation involved potential command-level complicity, which made prior notification a compromise risk. Harwick looked at Oakes. I understand the law, Colonel. I'm asking about the 6 days that an undercover federal operative was on one of my installations under a cover identity. With respect, General, Maya said, the question of notification was weighed against the documented pattern of complaint suppression at this installation. Prior notification through command channels would have been reported to Colonel Hale within hours. The evidence collected in the past 6 days would not exist. He looked at her. That's a very clean sentence. I've had time to think about how to say it, she said. He held for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not even approval, but a kind of reluctant recognition. What do you have? He said. Delaran walked him through it. Audio, video, documentation of 6 separate incidents across 6 days. Knox's voluntary interview. The shadow complaint registry in Hale's office. The phone records. The complaint Pierce had filed at 0300, which now existed in the case file as evidence of consciousness of guilt and attempted intimidation of a federal officer. Ruiz's witness statement, given voluntarily and documented at 0515 that morning. Harwick listened without expression. His aides took notes. Oakes interjected occasionally to clarify legal standing on specific pieces of evidence. Delaran spoke for 31 minutes without significant interruption. When he finished, Harwick was quiet for a while. Then he said, Hale has been here 6 years. Yes, sir, Delaran said. And you're telling me that for 6 years, this installation had a functional system for intercepting and suppressing complaints run by the commanding officer, and no one in my regional oversight structure detected it. That is what the evidence indicates, sir. Another silence. Harwick picked up a pen and turned it between his fingers. Not a nervous gesture, a thinking gesture. How many women, he said. Total. Including whatever Knox gave you. We're still verifying, Delaran said. Current count is 39. We expect that number to grow as we make contact with prior personnel. Harwick put the pen down. I want a full brief from Oakes on prosecution timeline by 1700. I want the 3 Marines confined to barracks and formally suspended from training duties as of this hour. Hale is suspended from command authority, effective immediately. His deputy takes over. He looked around the table. And I want to understand how this installation gets rebuilt in a way that doesn't produce another Victor Hale in 6 years. That's not a legal question. That's an institutional one. And I'm putting it on this table now because if we wait until after the court-martial to ask it, we'll have wasted another opportunity. He stood. The room stood with him. He looked at Maya last. His expression was specific enough that she felt it, but couldn't entirely categorize it. You spent 6 days on this base being... He stopped. Chose the next word carefully. Being targeted by people who should have known better and by a system that should have stopped it. He paused. I'm not going to thank you for doing your job. That would be insulting. But I want to say on record that what you documented here and how you documented it gives us something that lasts. 39 women gave me the reason, she said. I just built the case. He nodded once, then he walked out. She found Abby Lawson at 1630 in the narrow strip of walkway outside the Eastern Barracks. Abby had heard things. Everyone had heard things. The kind of structured rumor that spreads through a military installation when something significant has happened and the official information hasn't caught up to the unofficial awareness yet. She was sitting with her back against the wall, looking at nothing specific, and she looked up when Maya sat down beside her. It's real, Abby said. Not a question. It's real, Maya confirmed. Abby exhaled slowly. It was not a dramatic breath, not the release of someone finally hearing something they'd been waiting to hear for a long time. It was more like the breath of someone acknowledging that a weight they'd learned to carry was still there, even though it was going to start being carried differently. What happens now? Abby said. Investigation, court-martial proceedings. Hale is suspended from command. Pierce, Mercer, and Knox are confined to barracks. She paused. You may be contacted for a witness statement. You don't have to give one, but your account of what you experienced would be useful. Abby looked at her hands. Martinez, she said. Did you reach her? She'll be contacted through the Federal Investigation Team, Maya said. Her account is part of what we're building. Abby nodded slowly. She left because nobody believed her, she said. She was good. She was really good at her job, and she left. I know, Maya said. Is there a point where the people who left get to know that it mattered, that what they said mattered? Abby looked at her. Or does this just become a case file that goes into a system somewhere, and the women who it happened to are just reference numbers? Maya held for a moment. It was a real question, and it deserved a real answer, which meant she wasn't going to give it a clean one. Some of it gets lost in the process, she said. I'm not going to tell you it doesn't. The legal machinery is what it is, and it doesn't always move in a way that feels like justice to the people who actually experience the thing. She paused. What I can tell you is that the 39 complaints that Hale put in a cabinet because he thought they'd stay there, they're out of the cabinet now, and whoever submitted them will be contacted, and their names will be in a public court-martial proceeding instead of a private filing system. She paused again. That's not everything, but it's not nothing either. Abby was quiet for a long time. 39, she said finally. That we know of, Maya said. Abby closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she looked steadier. Not lighter, not happier, but steadier. The way a person looks when they've finished making a decision and the making of it has replaced some of the uncertainty with something firmer. I'll give a statement, she said. Whatever they need. I'll make sure the right people know, Maya said. The debrief with Westmore happened at 2000, over a secure line, and it lasted 40 minutes. Westmore listened to the full summary without interrupting, which was characteristic. She had the rare quality of someone who processed information by receiving it completely before doing anything with it, rather than processing in real time at the cost of half of what was being said. When Maya finished, Westmore was quiet for about 10 seconds. 39, she said. Growing, Maya said. The shadow registry changes everything, Westmore said. A defense attorney can argue that Hale failed to act, that he was negligent, that his oversight was inadequate. None of those arguments survive the evidence that he was maintaining original documentation. That's not negligence. That's intent. I know. The JAG team is going to want to move quickly, Westmore said. This is the kind of case that gets complicated by time. Witnesses scatter, memories adjust. Institutional pressure builds on everyone who still has a career to protect. They'll push for a pre-trial agreement timeline. Oakes seemed like she understood that, Maya said. Oakes is good, Westmore said. She paused. How are you? It was not a question Westmore asked lightly. Maya had known her long enough to understand that, to know that when Westmore asked how you were, she was asking about something specific. Not wellness in the general sense, but the particular internal state of a person who had just spent 6 days inside a situation that required suppressing certain things in order to function, and who was now on the other side of it and had to figure out where those things went. I'm all right, Maya said. That's not an answer, Westmore said. A pause. It was 6 days, Maya said. I've been in longer operations with harder... That's not what I'm asking about, Westmore said. Maya looked at the vehicle's windshield. The base lights were coming on across the desert, orange and functional, turning the dust into something almost warm. I'm all right, she said again. I'll be better in a few days. Right now I'm still inside it. That's an honest answer, Westmore said. Good. I keep thinking about the 39, Maya said. Not the case. The people. That's correct, Westmore said. That's the correct thing to keep thinking about. She paused. It's also the thing that makes this work survivable in the long run. The other version, the version where you stop thinking about the people and only think about the case, that's the one that costs you something you don't get back. Maya was quiet for a moment. You figured that out the hard way. Everyone does, Westmore said. They stayed on the line for a few more minutes without saying much, and then Westmore said goodnight, and the call ended, and Maya sat in the vehicle in the dark desert for a long time. She thought about the file she had read on the drive out, the 12 names, which were now 39 names, which would be more than that by the time the investigation finished expanding outward through all the installations and all the years and all the carefully filed and forgotten pieces of paper that a man named Victor Hale had believed would stay where he put them. She thought about what Harwick had said. Something that lasts. She thought about the knife in her equipment locker, the one she'd brought from home with the inscription she'd had put on it 11 years ago, after she had stood in front of a review board and given her account and walked out into the sunlight afterward feeling both vindicated and hollow in the specific way of someone who has won something at the exact moment they understand how much better it would have been to never have needed to win it. Patience defeats arrogance. She had written that on a piece of paper during the lowest month of the year after Fort Calloway, and had meant it then as a reminder, a discipline, a commitment to a different way of fighting. She had put it on the knife because she wanted the thing she carried to remember it, even when she didn't. The reminder had held. The patience had held. And tomorrow the work that came after the patience began. The slower, longer, less operationally clean work of making sure that what had been built in 6 days survived the 18 months of legal process that would try to dismantle it, and that the 39 women at the end of it had something real when it was done. She was not done, but she was, for the first time in 6 days, exactly where she needed to be. She left Iron Ridge on a Tuesday morning, 6 days after she'd arrived, in the same rented truck with the same locked box under the passenger seat. The box was heavier now. Not physically. The contents were the same, the files she'd read on the drive in, the documentation she'd brought as baseline, but it carried something additional in the way that objects sometimes do when the thing around them is changed significantly. She drove the 60 miles back to the nearest civilian road without turning on the radio, watching the desert flatten out ahead of her and the mountains shrink in the rearview mirror until they were just a gray line at the edge of the sky. She had slept 4 hours the night before, not because she couldn't sleep longer. The operational tension had broken, and her body wanted rest the way it always did once the sustained alertness wasn't required anymore. She had woken at 04:30 out of habit and had lain in the dark for 90 minutes thinking about what came next, which was not a single thing, but a sequence of things that would take the better part of 2 years and would require her to be present for most of it in ways that were different from the presence she'd just been asked for. The court-martial process was not the operation. It was what the operation made possible. She understood the difference clearly enough that she didn't romanticize either one. The investigation expanded the way Delloran had predicted and faster than Harwick had hoped. Within 10 days of Maya's departure from Iron Ridge, the federal investigation team had made contact with 22 of the 39 women whose complaints had been filed and suppressed. Of those 22, 17 agreed to provide formal witness statements. 4 declined and gave no reason, which was their right, and Maya noted each of the 4 in her own records not as a failure, but as a number. 4 people for whom the cost of engaging with the system again was still higher than the potential value of what the system might now offer them. She understood that completely. She didn't press. The other 5 couldn't be located immediately. Reassignments, separations, address changes that hadn't propagated through the right channels. The investigation team kept looking. 14 days after the operation closed, Delloran sent her a message with a single line. Martinez wants to talk to you directly. Here's her number. Maya stared at the number for a long time before she called it. Martinez. Specialist Elena Martinez, who had filed a complaint 18 months ago that had disappeared into Hale's shadow registry and whose request for reassignment had been processed in 11 days, a speed that suggested it was helped along rather than simply approved, answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was careful, measured, the voice of someone who had learned to be careful about phone calls and was working through the muscle memory of that caution even now. You're the one who went in, she said. Yes, Maya said, a pause. How did the case find me? I mean, I know how, but… She stopped. I filed that complaint, and then it was like it went into a hole. I stopped believing anyone would ever see it. Someone saw it, Maya said. It just took longer than it should have. A longer pause. Was it… Martinez stopped again, and when she spoke next there was something in her voice that was different from the caution. Something more like the effort of a person trying to ask a question they've been carrying for a long time. Was it enough? What I wrote. For the case. It was specific, detailed, and consistent with the accounts of 11 other women from the same period, Maya said. Your complaint is one of the strongest documents in the file. She heard Martinez exhale. It was not the dramatic breath of someone receiving news they've been waiting for. It was smaller than that, more private. The sound of a single piece of something settling into a place it had been unable to settle for a year and a half. I left, Martinez said. I left because I thought if I stayed, it would just keep happening and no one was ever going to… She stopped. I was good at my job. I know, Maya said. That's in your record, and it'll be in the case record too. Does it matter? The career stuff. At this point? Maya considered that. It matters for the picture it creates, she said. A pattern of strong performers leaving the same installation under similar circumstances. That's part of how you prove the impact is real and the damage is real. It's not just names on paper. It's careers that went sideways, and that's documentable. Okay, Martinez said. She said it quietly, like someone accepting something they weren't entirely sure they accepted yet, but were willing to try. I'll give the statement. Someone from the investigation team will contact you this week, Maya said. If anything feels wrong about the process, here's a direct number. She read off Oakes's contact. She's JAG. She answers her phone. Thank you, Martinez said. Then after a pause, for going in. I needed to, Maya said, and meant it in a way that wasn't about duty. The court-martial proceedings opened 8 weeks later at a federal military installation in San Diego, which was far enough from Iron Ridge that Hale's remaining institutional relationships didn't have direct lines to the proceeding and close enough to the West Coast JAG office that Oakes could manage both the prosecution and the witness logistics without it becoming a resource problem. Maya attended the opening session as a witness, not as counsel or investigative lead. The formal operational role was Delloran's and the legal role was Oakes's, which was how it was supposed to work and how she preferred it. She sat in the designated witness area in her service uniform with her actual credentials and rank, which she hadn't worn in 6 days at Iron Ridge and which felt now like putting back on a skin that had always fit, but that she needed to set aside for a while. The three Marines came in first, separately, each with counsel. Knox came last, and he looked different from the training structure, smaller somehow, and not physically. He sat down beside his attorney and kept his eyes forward, and did not look at anyone else in the room. Pierce was at the opposite end, and his posture was the same as it had always been. Squared shoulders, jaw set, the performance of composure maintained past the point where it was convincing anyone. Cole Mercer sat between his attorney and a stack of documents and looked at the table. Hale arrived with two attorneys, which said more about the case against him than anything that had been announced. He was in civilian clothing. The dress uniform that would have been appropriate for the context had been set aside by his legal team, Maya assumed, on the grounds that the visual of a decorated senior officer in uniform created a sympathy framing that would conflict with the evidentiary reality. He sat down and folded his hands on the table in front of him with the precise, settled stillness of a man who had spent 6 years building a system he believed was airtight and was now in the process of understanding that it wasn't. He did not look at Maya. She looked at him. She had spent 4 months before Iron Ridge building a picture of Victor Hale from files and phone records and the accounts of people he had damaged, and she had spent 6 days on his installation building a case against him, and she had felt many things about him across those months that had been useful and some that had not been. What she felt looking at him now, across the quiet room as the proceeding began, was not triumph, and was not satisfaction, and was not closure, because none of those were the right shape for what this was. What she felt was the specific gravity of a thing finally being weighed by something with the authority and the tools to weigh it. That was enough. The proceedings lasted 11 weeks. She was not present for most of them. Her testimony took 2 days. The first day covering the operational framework, the documentation methodology, and the chain of evidence. The second covering the 6 days on the base, the encounters, the 2 physical confrontations, and her witness observations of Hale's behavior during the Eastern Corridor incident on day 4. Oakes examined her. Pierce's defense attorney cross-examined her for 4 hours, which was aggressive and thorough and did not produce anything useful for the defense, though it produced several moments where Maya had to manage the specific frustration of being asked to repeat things she had said clearly and simply, as if repetition might cause them to mean something different. It did not. She testified calmly. She answered what was asked. She corrected 3 mischaracterizations of the evidence, cited the specific documentation that contradicted them, and declined to editorialize when the defense asked her whether she felt she had acted appropriately on the base. "Yes," she said. "I followed operational protocol and responded to physical contact in accordance with my training." "You injured 2 of the defendants." Cole Mercer sustained a shoulder contusion during a physical confrontation he initiated. Ethan Knox sustained a wrist sprain when I removed a training blade that he had pressed against my uniform. Both injuries were minor and both resulted from the defendant's own actions. "You're trained in hand-to-hand combat?" "Yes." "At a level significantly beyond standard military qualification?" "Yes." "And you concealed that capability during your time on the installation?" She looked at the defense attorney. "I was undercover. The entire operation involved concealing capabilities from the subjects of the investigation. That is the definition of an undercover operation." "Nothing further," the attorney said. Ruiz testified on day 4 of the proceeding. He sat in the witness position with the composure of someone who had made a decision and arrived at it in advance of the room, which meant nothing could happen in the room that would unmake it. He described what he had seen in the Eastern Corridor. The spacing, the training knife, the confined space, the absence of any tactical reason for 3 armed personnel to be in that configuration with one person who was clearly not positioned voluntarily. He described walking through, processing it too slowly, and regretting it by noon. "Why didn't you intervene?" Oakes asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I told myself it wasn't my business, and then I spent the rest of the day telling myself that wasn't true." He paused. "I should have done something that day. I didn't. But when someone gave me the chance to do something later, I took it." Oakes nodded. No further questions. The defense had nothing for Ruiz. They had learned quickly that witnesses who had already done their own reckoning were not productive targets for cross-examination. Martinez's statement was submitted in written form, read into the record by Oakes on day 6. Maya was not in the room for that session, but DeLorean sent her a message that said only, strong, very strong. And she sat with that in her temporary office at the JAG facility and thought about a woman who had left a job she was good at because no one had believed her, and who had then been asked to tell it again to a room that was now required to listen. Reyes was located in week 3. She had separated from service and was working in private security in Phoenix, and she agreed to testify by video deposition rather than in person, which the court accepted. Her testimony ran 40 minutes and covered 3 separate incidents over a 7-week period at Iron Ridge, each one documented in her original complaint, each one confirmed against Knox's voluntary interview statements. The woman named Faust, first name was Diane, which Maya noted with a quiet, unintentional jolt of recognition, had separated from service 4 years earlier and had initially declined to participate. She changed her mind in week 6 after Oakes made a second contact and explained that the evidentiary record already supported the case, but that her account would matter to the other women whose accounts were part of it. She submitted a written statement. It was 7 pages, single-spaced, and Oakes later described it to Maya as the most precise account of institutional failure I've read in 22 years of this work. The verdicts came on a Wednesday in early spring. Logan Pierce, guilty on 4 counts, including physical assault of a federal officer, conspiracy to obstruct an official investigation, and conduct unbecoming. Sentenced to 36 months confinement, dishonorable discharge, permanent ban from federal service. Cole Mercer, guilty on 3 counts, 24 months confinement, dishonorable discharge. Ethan Knox, guilty on 2 counts, 18 months confinement, dishonorable discharge. His cooperation during the investigation was noted by the panel as a mitigating factor in sentencing, which was not leniency, it was precision. He had helped build the case and the case had been built, and that was a separate accounting from the fact of what he had done. Victor Hale, guilty on 7 counts. The shadow complaint registry had been the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, and the defense had spent 8 of 11 weeks attempting to contextualize it, reframe it, explain it as a misguided but well-intentioned administrative practice. The panel had read the 39 complaints. They had heard 17 witnesses. They had seen the original documents, the dates on them, the routing codes that showed where each complaint had been diverted. The fact that for 6 years, every woman who had walked into that system and trusted it with her account had had that account taken out of the system and put in a man's filing cabinet and left there. The panel found him guilty on all 7 counts. He received 60 months confinement, forfeiture of rank, forfeiture of pension, and a dishonorable discharge that ended 32 years of service in a single sentence read aloud by the military judge in a quiet room on a Wednesday morning. Maya was in the room for that one. She watched Hale's face when the sentence was read. He did not crumble. He was too controlled for that. But the stillness that had characterized him, the settled, deliberate, architectural stillness of a man who had built a world around his own untouchability, that broke. Not dramatically, just a small, almost invisible fracture, the way something structural finally yields after a force that has been applied for a very long time. His hands unfolded from the table. He sat back a fraction of an inch. His eyes went somewhere private for a moment before he brought them back. She watched it happen and felt the specific, complicated gravity of it. Not satisfaction, because satisfaction had never been the right word for this. Something more like the feeling you get when a weight you've been carrying for a long time is finally set down by someone who has the authority to take it. And the setting down doesn't make you lighter immediately because you've been shaped by the weight, and that shape takes time to adjust. She sat with it. Then she got up, walked out of the room, and stood in the hallway of the JAG facility in the thin California spring sunlight that came through the tall windows in long, angled bars, and she called Westmore. "It's done," she said. Westmore was quiet for a moment on the other end. "All counts?" "All 7. Another pause. "Good," Westmore said. She didn't say more than that. She didn't need to. Westmore had spent 32 years building cases that the system had then either honored or wasted, and she understood the specific restraint of not eulogizing a verdict while it was still warm. "What are you going to do now?" Westmore said. "There's a training assignment," Maya said. "West Coast. They want me to run a new integration oversight program, Harwick's recommendation." "Do you want to do it?" Maya looked at the sunlight on the hallway floor. She thought about the question honestly, the way she tried to think about most things. Not the version of honest that involves performing uncertainty, but the actual kind, where you look at what you actually want and don't clean it up before you see it. "I think I'm tired," she said. "Of course you are," Westmore said. "That's not what I asked." "Yeah," Maya said, "I want to do it." "Then do it," Westmore said. Simply, the way Westmore said most things. Mom. She drove to Iron Ridge one more time before she started the new assignment. She didn't have a professional reason. The installation was under interim command. The oversight restructuring was being handled by a separate team, and her operational role in everything connected to the investigation had formally closed when the verdicts were filed. She drove there anyway, on a clear morning 3 weeks after the sentencing, on a road that felt different in the daylight than it had felt the first time she'd driven it in the dark. The gate guard was different this time. He processed her credentials, her actual ones, no numbered armband, and she drove to the eastern compound and parked and sat in the truck for a moment. The base looked the same. It always looked the same. That was the thing about institutional spaces. They were specifically designed to be resilient to individual events, to absorb change and continue presenting the same face, the whitewashed borders along the paths, the precisely angled vehicles, the dry mountains holding the heat at the edges. But she knew it wasn't the same. She knew what was different, even if the buildings couldn't say it. She got out of the truck, walked to Building 4, went inside. The eastern corridor was empty. It smelled like concrete and machine oil and the faint chemical trace of cleaning products, the same as it had always smelled. The fluorescent at the far end was fixed. The buzzing was gone, replaced by steady, clean light. The equipment lockers were lined up along the wall, identical, numbered. She stood in the corridor for about 2 minutes. She was not having a moment. She was not performing closure for an audience that wasn't there. She had learned to be skeptical of the idea that standing in a place would do something that the work hadn't already done. And she remained skeptical, but she had needed to see it empty and ordinary and lit properly. To see it as what it was. A corridor in a building, nothing more, stripped of the specific weight it had carried for 6 days. To verify that the weight was not in the corridor but in the case file and the verdict and the 39 names in the public court-martial record. That's where it belonged. She turned around and walked out. Abby Lawson called her 2 months after the verdicts. Maya was in her temporary housing near the new assignment, in the middle of reviewing a structural outline for the integration oversight program. She answered on the second ring. "I got into the pipeline," Abby said. For a moment, Maya thought she'd misheard. Then, "Special Operations Pipeline? Applied 6 weeks ago, found out yesterday." Abby's voice was doing something complicated. Not quite the clean joy of someone announcing good news, but the more layered thing that happens when a good thing arrives carrying the full weight of everything that made it necessary. "I almost didn't apply. I went back and forth on it for 3 weeks." "What decided it?" Maya said. "Maya says, I kept thinking about what you said. That the ending wasn't written yet." She paused. "I figured I should be the one writing it." Maya sat back in her chair. Through the window of the temporary housing, the California coast was visible in the distance, a blue-gray line where the land stopped. She looked at it for a moment. "You're going to be excellent at it," she said. "I don't know about that," Abby said. "I might wash out." "You might," Maya agreed. "That's a real possibility. It's a hard pipeline." "I know." "But you applied," Maya said. "That's the part that matters." Abby was quiet for a moment. "Did you always know that you wanted to do this kind of work?" Maya thought about that honestly. She thought about Fort Calloway and the review board and a woman named Westmore who had sat across from her in a temporary office and asked her what she wanted. She thought about the 11 years between that question and Iron Ridge, the specific shape of the answer she'd spent those years building. "No," she said. "I knew I wasn't willing to let certain things keep happening. The rest of it I figured out as I went." "Okay," Abby said. "That's helpful, actually." "Good luck," Maya said. "Yeah," Abby said. "You too." Yeah. The Integration Oversight Program launched 4 months after the Iron Ridge verdicts. It was not a dramatic launch. It didn't look like much from the outside. A policy document? A set of revised reporting protocols? an independent complaint registry that sat outside the installation command structure and fed directly to a federal oversight body. It covered 12 installations in the Western region. It included mandatory training for all personnel above E5 on what bystander responsibility looked like in practice, as opposed to in theory. It included anonymous reporting architecture that had been designed by a team that included 2 women from the original 39 who had been asked to consult on what a system that actually worked would need to look like. Maya ran the pilot program at the first installation and then handed day-to-day operations to a team she'd spent 3 months building and another month training. She didn't stay with the program because it needed her. She stayed long enough to make sure it didn't need her, which was a different thing, and in her view, a more useful one. On the last day before she transitioned formally out of the oversight program role, one of her team members, a young Army captain named Doss, who had come into the program through a referral from Harwick's office and who had turned out to be exactly the kind of person you wanted running something like this, stopped her in the hallway and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," she said. "Did you know when you went into Iron Ridge, did you know it was going to work?" She thought about that, about the pre-dawn cold of the vehicle, the bad coffee, the 4 months of preparation and the 6 days of performance, and the 2 hours lying in the dark running contingencies for all the ways it could collapse. "No," she said, "I knew it could work. I knew what it needed. But you never know." She paused. "That's why you build it as carefully as you can, so that if you do everything right, there's nothing left to chance." "But there's always something left to chance," Doss said. "Yes," she said, "there's always something." She picked up her bag. "That's why you don't do it alone." She walked out into the California morning. The combat knife was back in her bag. She had carried it for 15 years, through training pipelines and forward positions and undercover operations, and a review board and a long, slow process of becoming someone who had learned the difference between fighting and building. The inscription on the blade had darkened with age and handling, but was still legible. "Patience defeats arrogance." She had chosen those words at 27 because they were true in an operational sense. Patience was tactically superior to aggression in the kind of work she did, and arrogance was a vulnerability she had learned to exploit in others and guard against in herself. But she had learned in the years since that the sentence meant something else too, something less tactical and more human. That the patience she'd built wasn't just the patience of waiting for the right moment, it was the patience of doing the work that didn't look like anything, the quiet work of building cases, building trust, building programs, building the kind of infrastructure that meant the next woman who filed a complaint into a system that should have protected her might actually be protected this time. That patience was not passive, it was not endurance. It was the most demanding kind of action, the kind that required you to keep going when the immediate return was invisible, when the thing you were building was too large to see from where you were standing. Arrogance couldn't sustain that. Arrogance needed quick returns, visible victories, the daily confirmation that its instincts were correct. Patience just needed to be right in the end. She drove north on the coast highway with the window down and the ocean air coming through, and the mountains in the rearview mirror, and the road ahead unscheduled for the first time in 4 months. She had a 3-day gap before her next assignment briefing. She intended to sleep for approximately 14 hours of it and spend the rest somewhere that didn't have a gate guard or a formation schedule. She had a name in mind, a small town north of San Francisco that she'd driven through once years ago and had filed under things worth returning to when there was time. There was time now. She thought about the 39 women, about the ones she'd spoken to and the ones she hadn't, the ones who had testified and the ones who hadn't been able to, the ones whose careers had rerouted and the ones who had rebuilt, and the ones who were still in the middle of figuring out how. She thought about Martinez, who had sent a single message to Delaron after the verdicts that had been forwarded to Maya. "Thank you for not forgetting us." She thought about Abby, somewhere in a training pipeline right now, probably exhausted and probably stubborn and probably more capable than she knew yet. She thought about Westmore in her consulting office in Virginia, answering her phone on the second ring. She thought about Ruiz, who had submitted a formal application to become an installation equal opportunity advisor 3 weeks after the verdicts, which Delaron had forwarded to her with a message that said, "Your instincts about people." She had not responded because there was nothing to add. The road curved and the ocean appeared on her left, flat and enormous and completely indifferent to the particular small weight of human history that she was carrying in the truck beside her. The sun was still low enough to be golden rather than white, and the light on the water was the kind that made things look more resolved than they were. She let it look that way for a while. She wasn't done. She was never going to be done, in the sense that the work would continue past her and beyond her, and would require people she hadn't met yet, and cases she hadn't built yet, and programs that would take years to prove out. She understood that clearly. But the thing that had started when she stood in front of a review board at 26 and said, "I want to build something they can't take apart," that thing had held. Not perfectly, not without cost, not without the years of bad coffee and pre-dawn contingency planning and the specific loneliness of work that couldn't be explained to most people and didn't need to be. It had held. And somewhere on a base in Nevada, a corridor was lit properly, and a filing cabinet was empty, and 39 names were in a public record where they belonged. That was not everything, but it was real, and it lasted, and no one was going to put it back in a cabinet. She drove north. The strongest thing you can do for someone who is suffering alone is to refuse to pretend you didn't see it. Because silence, when you have the power to speak, is never neutral. It is always a choice. Choose differently.